Ancient Egypt, a journey through time. Hi there. If you're here, you're probably looking for two things: a little bit of history and a whole lot of sleep. So lie back, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow like it owes you rent, and let me take you back to a time where mornings smelled like goats and afternoons felt like slow cooking inside a brick oven. Tonight, we travel to ancient Egypt, a land of gods, gold, and glorious inconvenience. Sure, we think of Egypt and imagine pyramids, majestic pharaohs, eyeliner on point, and maybe a cat lounging on a golden cushion. But the truth, it was more sand, sweat, and survival than statuesque serenity. So, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and prepare to feel profoundly grateful you weren't born 3,000 years earlier. Ancient Egypt, the land of mystery, magic, and mosquitoes the size of locusts. Popular culture paints it as a glorious civilization of advanced science and divine beauty, which it was, if you were royalty. If not, it was kind of like camping, forever, with sand in places you didn't know you had. People today imagine elegant robes and golden chalices. In reality, imagine waking up on a straw mat with your knees in your cousin's ribs, your back against a sweating mud wall, and the sun already poking you in the eye like, hey, time to bake. No privacy, no fans, just you, the heat, and a linen sheet thinner than your will to face the day. You wake up in ancient Egypt, or rather, you stop trying to sleep through the heat and buzz of flies. Your body aches from the straw mat, your skin sticks to the linen, and your hair, well, it's mostly sand now. Your house is made of mud brick. It's efficient, sure, but it also turns into an oven by noon. The windows, no glass, just open holes, letting in air, light, and the occasional ibis. Family members are everywhere. There's no separate room, no me time, just shared space and the vague hope that someone didn't snore too loudly through the night. The air is still, already warm. You haven't even stepped outside and you're sweating. The morning ritual. Dawn filters through the small window openings of your mud brick home, casting long fingers of light across the packed earth floor. You've been half awake for hours already, listening to the rhythmic breathing of your family members, all 8 of them, crammed into this single room that serves as bedroom, living room, and sometimes kitchen when the weather turns foul. Your grandmother's gentle snoring finally tapers off as she stirs, the family's natural alarm clock. The sleeping arrangements are practical, if not comfortable. The youngest children sleep closest to the center, surrounded by parents and older siblings, a human fortress against night predators and the occasional scorpion that might wander in. The elderly sleep slightly elevated, their reed mats placed atop low mud brick platforms to ease their aging joints and make it simpler for them to rise in the morning. You rub your eyes, feeling the familiar grit of sand. It's everywhere, between your toes, in the folds of your linen wrap, even caught in your eyelashes. You'll never be truly clean. That's just a fact of life in a country where the desert is always encroaching. always whispering at the edges of civilization. Someone has already risen before you, probably your mother or older sister, and relit the small clay oil lamp that provides the only artificial light in your home. Its dim glow hardly cuts through the shadows, but it's enough to avoid stepping on the family cat, who serves the dual purpose of pest control and occasional companionship. The Egyptians don't worship cats as gods, exactly, but they respect them as guardians against vermin and carriers of good fortune. Your particular feline is missing half an ear from a fight and has the perpetual look of having just tasted something disappointing. Still, she keeps the mice at bay, so she earns her keep. Breaking your fast, there's no cereal or coffee waiting for you. Breakfast is simple: bread and beer, but not the good kind. The bread is rock hard and has more grit than a desert storm. You'll chew it with teeth already worn down by years of eating stone-laced loaves. The grinding of grain begins at first light. The women of the house take turns at the saddle quern, a large, slightly curved stone, upon which grain is ground into flour using a smaller hand stone. The motion is repetitive and taxing, forward and back, for what feels like eternity. The sound of stone against stone becomes the percussion of morning, a rhythmic scraping that signals the day has truly begun. The flour produced is coarse, filled with tiny stone fragments that have worn away from the grinding stones. These invisible intruders will steadily erode your teeth over a lifetime, leaving most elderly Egyptians with painfully worn dental surfaces or missing teeth entirely. But hunger doesn't allow for dental concerns. The dough is mixed with water from the clay storage jar in the corner, water fetched yesterday from the canal that branches off from the life-giving Nile. Sometimes, if the harvest has been good and taxes not too severe, you might add a handful of dates or figs to the mixture, or perhaps a sprinkle of cumin or coriander for flavor. But most days, it's just the basics: flour, water, salt, if you're fortunate. The bread is shaped into flat rounds and baked in a conical clay oven that stands in the communal courtyard shared by several families. Taking your turn at the oven means enduring the scorching heat that radiates from its walls, adding to the already oppressive temperature of the Egyptian morning. The loaves emerge hard on the outside, chewy within, and inevitably containing more than a little sand that found its way into the dough. The beer is warm, thick, and vaguely sour. Think of it as survival porridge with bubbles. It's not indulgent. It's necessity. Even kids drink it because the water is, frankly, suspicious. The brewing process, at least, kills many of the waterborne parasites and bacteria that might otherwise lead to debilitating intestinal distress. This beer bears little resemblance to modern varieties. It's thick enough to almost chew, with bits of partially fermented bread floating on the surface. You drink it from a clay cup, sometimes through a reed straw to filter out the larger particulates. The alcohol content is low, but it provides essential calories and nutrients that help you survive the demanding physical labor ahead. If you're lucky, you get an onion. If you're really lucky, a date. But mostly, it's carbs and hope. The onion isn't a garnish or flavoring. It's a main course, a luxury even. Egyptians revere onions not just for their taste, but for their believed medicinal and spiritual properties. Workers building the pyramids were even paid partially in radishes, onions, and garlic, valued for their ability to promote strength and prevent disease. You bite into yours with appreciation, savoring the sharp, pungent flavor that cuts through the monotony of bread and beer. Morning ablutions. There's no shower, no sink, no minty toothpaste. You splash your face with Nile water scooped from a jar. Technically, it's fresh. Realistically, it's a gamble. The water jar sits in the coolest corner of the house, covered with a damp cloth to promote evaporation and keep the contents slightly cooler than the surrounding air. It's cloudy with sediment, but settling overnight has allowed the worst of the particulates to sink to the bottom. You're careful not to disturb this natural filtration as you dip a smaller cup into the vessel. The morning wash is perfunctory at best. You splash your face and rinse your mouth, spitting into a small drainage channel that runs along the edge of the courtyard. If you're of higher status, you might have a copper or bronze basin for washing. If you're among the common folk, a simple clay bowl serves the purpose. Either way, cleanliness is valued in Egyptian society, even if the means to achieve it are primitive by modern standards. To clean yourself, you use natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt found in dried lake beds, mixed with oil to create a paste that helps remove dirt and sweat. For those who can't afford natron, there's always sand. Yes, sand. It exfoliates. It also chafes. But it's better than smelling like whatever died in the heat yesterday. Wealthier Egyptians might bathe daily in small pools or with water poured by servants. For most, however, a full body wash is a luxury reserved for special occasions or religious ceremonies. The Nile itself serves as the community bathtub, though one must always be wary of crocodiles, hippos, and the various parasites that make the river their home. Women often bathe at dawn, men at dusk, with designated areas to maintain some semblance of modesty. For dental care, maybe you rub your teeth with a twig from the Salvadora persica tree, what will later be known as a miswak stick, frayed at one end to form a primitive brush. The wood contains natural antibacterial compounds and helps freshen breath. Maybe not. Either way, you've got morning breath no oil blend can fix. Hair, you oil it. Skin, you oil that too. It's the cure-all. Also, the cause of a constant glisten that screams, I live in a furnace. The oils serve multiple purposes. They moisturize skin dried by the harsh climate, provide a barrier against the sun, and mask body odors that accumulate rapidly in the heat. Common folk use simple vegetable oils or animal fat. The wealthy might add fragrant resins or herbs to create perfumed unguents. For special occasions, both men and women might place a cone of scented fat atop their heads, designed to slowly melt throughout the day, releasing pleasing aromas and conditioning the hair. Lice are a constant companion for many. You might run a fine-toothed comb through your hair, if you own one, to remove the worst of the infestation. Some shave their heads entirely and wear wigs for both cleanliness and status. The ultimate ancient Egyptian life hack. Dressing for the day, you might wear a linen tunic, which sounds airy until you remember it's over 100 degrees and there's no shade. It's breathable in the way tissue paper might be, and you own maybe one or two of them. The linen is hand-woven on simple looms by the women of the household or purchased in the village markets if your family has the means. The fabric itself is a product of immense labor. Flax plants must be grown, harvested, retted, soaked to separate fibers, beaten, combed, spun into thread, and finally woven into cloth. The finest linens are reserved for the elite and for mummy wrappings. Yours is coarser, but still represents significant investment of time and resources. Men typically wear a simple kilt-like garment wrapped around the waist and secured with a belt, leaving the upper body bare for work. Women wear straight shifts that reach from just below the breasts to the ankles, held up by straps over the shoulders. Children often wear nothing at all until puberty, practical in a climate where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade, that is. Your clothing is white or off-white, the natural colors of the linen. Dyed fabrics exist, but are costly and generally reserved for the wealthy or for special ceremonial garments. The white serves a practical purpose as well, reflecting the brutal Egyptian sun rather than absorbing it. Laundry day means scrubbing it in river water and hoping no crocodile swings by. The washing is done by beating the garments on flat stones along the riverbank, using natron or plant saponins as a primitive form of soap. The wet linen is spread on bushes to dry in the sun, which helps bleach it back to whiteness and kills many parasites that might have taken up residence in the fibers. Sandals if you're lucky, barefoot if you're not. Either way, the ground is lava. Sandals are plaited from papyrus reeds or palm fibers, with leather versions available for those of higher status. They're simple affairs, just a sole with straps to hold them to the foot. But they make a significant difference when walking across scorching sand or sharp-edged rocks. Still, many go without, their feet permanently calloused, ankles always dusty, and there's always at least one pebble stuck between their toes. For most Egyptians, personal adornment is minimal but meaningful. A simple amulet of faience, a glazed ceramic material, might hang around your neck, representing a protective deity or symbol. Small hoops of copper or bronze might pierce your ears. If you're a woman, you might line your eyes with malachite, ground green stone, or galena, ground black ore, using a small stick of wood or ivory. This eye makeup isn't just decorative, it helps reduce glare from the sun and may even have had antibacterial properties that helped prevent eye infections common in the dusty environment. Men's Day, labor and conscription. If you're a man, especially during certain dynasties, you may be called to serve. It's not a standing army in the modern sense, but conscription was real. Pharaohs didn't build empires alone. The conscription system operates on a rotating basis. Villages are required to provide a certain number of able-bodied men for military service or for massive public works, projects like temple construction or canal maintenance. When the royal messenger arrives, with papyrus scrolls bearing the seal of Pharaoh, hearts sink throughout the community. who will be taken this time, and for how long. Military training begins with endless running and calisthenics in the desert heat. You might train with spears, bows, or simple wooden shields covered with hide. Combat instruction is hands-on and brutal. Broken bones and lasting injuries are common. The Egyptian army isn't highly specialized like later forces. Most soldiers are essentially farmers with weapons, though elite units and chariot warriors receive more extensive training. Campaigns into Nubia or the Levant might last months or even years. You march across blistering deserts and rocky terrain, carrying your own equipment and surviving on dried rations, supplemented by whatever can be foraged or, more often, taken from settlements along the way. Disease kills more men than enemy weapons. Dysentery, infected wounds, and fevers thin the ranks long before battle is joined. If you're among the fortunate who return home, you come bearing stories, perhaps small items of plunder, and almost certainly scars, both visible and hidden. Some veterans receive small parcels of land as reward for service, elevating their status in the community. Others return to find their positions in village life filled by others, their skills at warfare having little application in the rhythms of agricultural existence. For those not called to military service, the primary occupation is agriculture. From dawn until the merciless sun makes fieldwork impossible in mid-afternoon, you labor in the fields alongside neighbors and family members. The work cycles with the seasons, plowing with wooden implements pulled by oxen after the annual Nile flood recedes, planting seeds in the nutrient-rich silt, endless weeding under the scorching sun, harvesting with simple sickles, threshing the grain by driving cattle over it to separate kernels from stalks. Every movement is calculated to conserve energy in the heat. Every task is accompanied by rhythmic work songs or chants that help coordinate group efforts and make the monotony bearable. Water carriers move among the workers with clay jars, providing brief relief from thirst, but never enough to truly quench it in the relentless Egyptian heat. At the edge of every field stands the scribe, recording quantities harvested, calculating the share that will go to the temple and to Pharaoh as tax. The ability to write and reckon is a passport out of physical labor, which is why many parents scrape together resources to apprentice promising sons to scribal schools, hoping they might escape the crushing cycle of agricultural toil. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, potters, metalworkers, stonecutters form a separate class with higher status than common laborers. Their expertise is passed from father to son through years of apprenticeship. They work in small workshops open to the street, tools and techniques largely unchanged for generations. For them, the daily routine involves specialized labor that requires precision despite the heat, dust, and poor lighting of their workspaces. Women's Day, the backbone of society. If you're a woman, your life is different, but no less exhausting. You rise earlier than the men, often before dawn, to begin the day's endless tasks. The grinding of grain is primarily women's work, an essential daily labor that might consume 2 to 3 hours each morning. The repetitive motion, pushing the upper grinding stone forward while kneeling behind the lower stone leads to distinctive skeletal markers found in female remains, enlarged arm muscles, knee joint deformities, and lower back problems that accumulate over decades of this fundamental task. Water carrying shapes both the day and the body. Multiple times daily, you walk to the nearest canal or to the Nile itself, fill in heavy clay jars that you balance on your head for the return journey. The perfect posture required becomes second nature, your neck muscles developing remarkable strength. Young girls begin with smaller vessels, gradually increasing the weight as they grow, their bodies adapting to this constant burden. The preparation of meals is constant and labor-intensive. Bread baking happens at least once and often twice daily. Vegetables must be cleaned and prepared, legumes soaked and boiled for hours, meat, on the rare occasions it's available, butchered and cooked slowly to make it palatable. Everything requires tending, stirring, adjusting. Neglect for even a short period might mean precious food is burned or spoiled. Childcare happens alongside these other tasks, not as a separate activity. Infants are strapped to your back while you work. Toddlers play at your feet as you grind grain or weave. Older children are assigned simple tasks appropriate to their age and strength. Breastfeeding continues for up to 3 years, providing crucial nutrition and some natural birth spacing in a time without reliable contraception. Textile production fills whatever moments might otherwise be free, from sorting raw flax fibers to spinning thread using a simple drop spindle, which can be operated while walking or supervising children, to the time-consuming process of weaving on upright looms, the creation of the family's clothing and household linens is perpetual. A single garment might represent weeks of labor, which explains why most Egyptians own so few clothes. But here's the twist. Compared to many ancient societies, Egyptian women had rights. You could own property, file for divorce, run a business, take someone to court. Marriage contracts from ancient Egypt reveal remarkable protections for women's economic interests. A wife retained ownership of the property she brought into the marriage and was entitled to support from her husband. If he divorced her without cause, substantial compensation was required. Women could initiate divorce proceedings themselves if they could prove abuse or neglect. In the marketplace, women appear as both vendors and purchasers. They could own businesses, particularly in textile production, food preparation, or brewing, areas where domestic skills translated to commercial enterprises. Documents show women lending money, purchasing land, and inheriting property from both male and female relatives. Legal papyri demonstrate that women could bring cases to court, testify as witnesses, and serve as parties in contracts, while male relatives often represented them in formal proceedings. Women's legal standing was nonetheless recognized. This level of legal personhood was unusual in the ancient world, where women in many societies were perpetually under male guardianship with few independent rights. Still, freedom didn't mean rest. You worked hard, gave birth with little help, kneeling on special birthing bricks, with female relatives providing support and midwives offering practical assistance and ritualistic protection. Childbirth was dangerous, with maternal mortality rates estimated at 15% per birth. Those who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered from prolapsed uteruses or other chronic health issues. You handled menstruation with folded linen pads held in place with belts or strings, washing and reusing these cloths monthly. During your period, certain religious rituals and temple spaces might be temporarily off limits, but normal work continued regardless of discomfort. Your beauty tools were toxic. Eye makeup containing lead compounds, skin preparations with potentially harmful minerals or plant extracts, but they served practical purposes too. Kohl eyeliner helped reduce glare and may have offered some protection against eye infections, common in the dusty environment. Your chores were relentless, from dawn until well after dusk, illuminated in the evening hours by dim oil lamps that produced more smoke than light. But you had agency, something rare in the ancient world. Communal life and evening hours as the sun begins its merciful descent. The rhythm of the day shifts. Men return from fields or workshops. Children gather in the central courtyards shared by several families. And the evening meal, typically the main meal of the day, is prepared. This meal might include bread, beer, vegetables like onions, leeks, and garlic, perhaps beans or lentils, and occasionally small fish netted from the canals. Meat is rare for common folk, appearing only during festivals or special occasions. Eating happens communally, with family members sitting on reed mats on the ground, food placed on low tables or dishes set directly on the clean-swept earth. Conversation flows around daily events, village gossip, concerns about the Nile's predicted flood level this year, speculation about whether the tax assessor will be more or less demanding than last season. Children are not segregated, but participate in family discussions, absorbing the practical knowledge and cultural values that will shape their futures. After the meal comes perhaps the most pleasant time of day. As darkness falls, the worst heat dissipates. Families emerge from their stifling homes to sit in courtyards or on rooftops, catching evening breezes. Neighbors visit, share news, help with communal tasks like repairing tools or mending nets. This is when stories are told, tales of gods and heroes, practical wisdom, moral lessons disguised as entertainment. An elder might recount the great deeds of a pharaoh from generations past, or explain why the constellation of Osiris appears in the night sky during certain seasons. Children listen wide-eyed, absorbing their cultural heritage through these oral traditions. Music often accompanies these evening gatherings. Simple instruments, reed flutes, small drums made of pottery with stretched skin coverings, sistrums, rattles associated with the goddess Hathor, or harps with few strings, provide rhythm and melody. Songs range from religious hymns to work songs, love poems set to music, or humorous verses that poke gentle fun at human foibles. Games offer another form of evening entertainment. Senet, played on a board with 30 squares, and movement determined by throwing marked sticks, precursors to dice, is popular among all social classes. Children play with simple clay toys, dolls made from twisted reeds, or games of physical skill like juggling or tug of war. As night deepens, oil lamps are extinguished to conserve precious fuel. The darkness is profound, broken only by starlight and perhaps the distant flickering of torches from a temple complex or administrative center. Conversation quiets. Bodies seek what comfort they can find on reed mats or padded linen bedding, and sleep comes until dawn arrives to begin the cycle anew. Chapter 3. The harsh truths. Life in ancient Egypt was delicate, often short, and never guaranteed. Childbirth was risky, infections spread easily, and life expectancy rarely reached what we now consider middle age. The fragility of life. The average lifespan for an ancient Egyptian hovered around 30 to 35 years. Though this figure masks significant variation, those who survived childhood, itself a major achievement, might live into their 50s or occasionally 60s, but they would be considered exceptionally elderly. Pharaohs, despite their supposedly divine nature and access to the best food and medical care, rarely exceeded this range. Examination of royal mummies shows that Ramesses II, who lived into his early 90s, was a dramatic outlier. Many children didn't survive past infancy. For every 10 children born, perhaps 4 or 5 would die before reaching age 5. The causes were numerous: dehydration from gastrointestinal diseases, respiratory infections, malnutrition, and accidents. Parents loved their children deeply. This is evident from letters, tomb inscriptions, and funerary practices. But they also maintained an emotional reserve, knowing that attachment too early might lead to devastating grief. Pregnancy and childbirth created a recurring cycle of danger for women. Medical papyri contain numerous remedies and incantations intended to ease labor pains, prevent miscarriage, or stop postpartum hemorrhage, indicating these were common and feared complications. Women gave birth in a squatting position on special birthing bricks, surrounded by female relatives and midwives who provided both practical assistance and ritual protection by invoking beneficial deities like Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess. Associated with childbirth, even small injuries could become fatal in a world without antibiotics or clean surgical tools. A simple cut while working in the fields might become infected, leading to blood poisoning that could kill within days. Broken bones, if they pierced the skin, rarely healed cleanly, and often resulted in chronic disability or fatal infection. Dental abscesses could spread infection to the brain, causing death from what would today be treated with routine antibiotics and dental procedures. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text, contains descriptions of 48 cases of trauma, including wounds, fractures, and dislocations. For each, the prognosis is categorized as favorable, uncertain, or unfavorable. For many serious injuries, the prescribed treatment is simply an ailment not to be treated. This frank acknowledgement of medical limitations reveals how many conditions were recognized as beyond help. The heat, the bugs, the constant physical labor, they wore people down fast. Examination of ancient Egyptian skeletons reveals patterns of wear that tell stories of incredibly demanding physical lives. Vertebrae compressed from carrying heavy loads, shoulders and elbows showing damage consistent with repetitive movements like grinding grain, knees deteriorated from constant kneeling on hard surfaces. By age 30, many Egyptians already exhibited arthritic changes that would be associated with much older individuals in modern populations. Parasitic diseases were ubiquitous, particularly those transmitted through water. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms that spend part of their life cycle in freshwater snails, infected many who worked in or near the Nile's waters. The parasite's eggs would lodge in body tissues, causing chronic inflammation, anemia, and eventually organ damage. Evidence of this disease has been found in mummies dating back to 3000 BCE, indicating its long history as a public health burden. Malaria thrived in the standing water left after the annual Nile flood. Mosquitoes breeding prolifically in irrigation canals and marshy areas. The cyclical fevers, debilitating fatigue, and potential for cerebral complications made this disease a significant cause of suffering and death. Some scholars suggest that genetic adaptations to malaria, such as the sickle cell trait found in some modern Egyptian populations, may have emerged during this period as a biological defense mechanism. Eye diseases were so common they were considered almost normal. The combination of intense UV exposure, blowing sand, and ubiquitous flies spreading bacteria led to conditions like trachoma, which could eventually cause blindness if untreated. Remedies for eye ailments make up a substantial portion of medical papyri, suggesting their prevalence and the significant impact they had on quality of life. The structure of society, you were vulnerable to forces beyond your control. Floods, droughts, disease, and famine. Every day was a tightrope walk between sustenance and scarcity, especially if you weren't born into wealth. The Nile's annual flood was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, but its rhythm wasn't always steady. Historical records indicate significant fluctuations in flood levels throughout Egyptian history. A flood that was too low meant insufficient water for irrigation and reduced agricultural yields. One too high could destroy homes, granaries, and field boundaries, leading to immediate devastation and long-term disruption of the agricultural system. While modern measurements show the Nile flood varied by an average of 4 to 5 meters annually, in human terms, this could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Storage systems attempted to buffer against scarcity. Grain was kept in household silos or communal granaries, but these reserves were vulnerable to insects, rodents, and mold in the humid climate. Successful storage required constant vigilance, turning the grain regularly, adding natural preservatives like herbs or minerals, and conducting perpetual war against vermin. Even with these precautions, post-harvest losses could reach 20% or more. The tax system added another layer of vulnerability. Regardless of how the harvest fared, a fixed proportion was claimed by the state and religious institutions. In years of plenty, this might leave sufficient surplus for the farmers. In lean years, it could mean surrendering grain needed for survival or seed for the next planting. Tax assessors rarely showed flexibility, as they themselves were under pressure to meet quotas set by higher authorities. Debt was a constant specter hanging over most households. When reserves ran short, loans of grain or other necessities were sought from neighbors, extended family, or wealthy patrons. Interest rates were steep, often 30–50% to be repaid after harvest. Failure to repay could result in forfeiture of land, enforced labor to work off the debt, or even temporary debt bondage of family members. Food security varied dramatically by social class. Tomb paintings depict elaborate feasts for the elite, tables laden with roasted meats, fruits, vegetables, bread, and wine, while archaeological evidence from non-elite contexts shows a much narrower diet based primarily on bread, beer, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small garden plots. Protein sources for common people came mainly from legumes, with meat appearing only occasionally, perhaps during religious festivals, when sacrificial animals were distributed. The structure of Egyptian society leaned heavily on inequality. At the base, slaves. Not everyone was enslaved, but slavery was foundational. Slavery in ancient Egypt differed somewhat from later systems. Most slaves were prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors rather than members of a specific racial or ethnic group. Their status could be temporary rather than hereditary, particularly for debt slaves who might eventually work off their obligations and return to free status. That said, chattel slavery, the outright ownership of human beings, was very real, particularly for those captured in military campaigns in Nubia, Libya, or the Levant. War captives formed the largest source of enslaved people. When Egyptian armies ventured into neighboring territories, they returned not just with plunder, but with human spoils. An inscription from the reign of Thutmose III claims he brought back 89,600 prisoners from a campaign in the Levant, a number that, while possibly exaggerated, indicates the scale of enslavement that could result from military activities. Debt slavery provided another pathway into bondage. Crop failures, injuries, preventing work, or other calamities might force families to offer their labor, or that of their children, as collateral for loans. While Egyptian law provided some protections, limiting the term of such servitude to 3 years in many cases, the reality could be much harsher, with creditors finding ways to extend control through additional loans or claims. The children of slaves often inherited their parents' status, creating generations of enslaved people. Some legal records indicate possibilities for manumission, release from slavery, particularly through adoption or marriage. But these cases appear to have been exceptional rather than common. The conditions of slavery varied widely depending on context. Those assigned to royal or temple construction projects faced brutal circumstances, exhausting labor, minimal rations, harsh discipline, and high mortality rates. Archaeological evidence from workers' cemeteries near major construction sites shows patterns of injury consistent with carrying heavy loads, along with signs of malnutrition and stress markers on bones. Household slaves might experience less physically demanding conditions, but remained subject to the complete control of their owners, including sexual exploitation, particularly for women and girls. Legal texts contain provisions regarding children born to enslaved women, and free men, indicating the commonplace nature of such situations. Slaves built monuments, served households, toiled in mines, and labored in the fields. The grandeur of temples and palaces was made possible by those who had none. The massive building projects that define ancient Egyptian civilization, the pyramids, temples, and palaces, required immense human resources. While some participants were free laborers working to fulfill corvée, mandatory labor, obligations, many were enslaved people working under constant supervision and threat of punishment. The turquoise and copper mines in the Sinai Peninsula represent some of the harshest conditions for enslaved labor. Workers toiled in narrow, poorly ventilated tunnels, using stone tools to extract minerals in scorching desert conditions with minimal water. Textual evidence suggests mortality rates at these mining expeditions were exceptionally high, with many workers not surviving a single season. Temple complexes, while celebrated for their spiritual significance, functioned as massive economic engines that depended heavily on slave labor. Major temples owned agricultural lands, workshops, and even entire towns, with enslaved populations providing the workforce for these diverse enterprises. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, at the height of its power, controlled resources comparable to a small kingdom, all managed through a complex administrative system that tracked human property alongside material assets. Stone quarries, where the massive blocks for monuments were cut, combined technical challenges with brutal physical demands. Workers used copper chisels and stone pounders to cut channels around blocks, inserted wooden wedges that were soaked with water to expand and crack the stone, then coordinated dozens or hundreds of laborers to move single blocks weighing tons. Accidents were common, medical care minimal, and the desert conditions extreme. Agricultural slavery was perhaps the most common form, with large estates owned by nobility or temples worked primarily by enslaved populations. These individuals planted, tended, and harvested crops under supervision of overseers who maintained production quotas. Through discipline that could include beating, food restriction, or other punishments recorded in administrative texts. The contrast between the enslaved and elite experiences of ancient Egypt could not be more stark. While one group created monuments meant to endure for eternity, they themselves were treated as disposable, their individual lives valued primarily for the labor they could provide rather than for any intrinsic human worth. Health, medicine, and belief. Illness was omnipresent. A cough could turn deadly. A scratch might mean infection. Medicine existed, but it was equal parts herbal remedy and incantation. The concept of disease causation in ancient Egypt blended observation with supernatural beliefs. Some conditions were recognized as resulting from obvious physical causes: a broken bone from a fall, an infected wound from an animal bite. Others, particularly internal diseases with no visible cause, were attributed to angry deities, malevolent spirits, or magical attacks by enemies. This dual understanding led to treatments that combined practical remedies with spiritual interventions. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most comprehensive medical texts from ancient Egypt, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains over 700 remedies and magical spells for a wide range of conditions. Reading through its pages gives us insights into both the sophisticated observation skills of Egyptian physicians and their inextricable connection to magical thinking. For fevers, the practical components might include cold compresses, specific herbal preparations, or dietary restrictions, while the spiritual elements involved reciting incantations to drive away the disease causing demons or appeasing the deity believed to have sent the illness as punishment. Neither approach was considered complete without the other. They formed complementary parts of a holistic healing system. Honey, garlic, moldy bread, they had their uses. These weren't random choices, but represented genuine empirical knowledge, passed down through generations of healers. Honey possesses natural antibacterial properties and was regularly used in wound dressings, where it created an inhospitable environment for many pathogens, while also providing a physical barrier. Archaeological evidence confirms its effectiveness. Some honey-dressed wounds on mummies show signs of successful healing without significant infection. Garlic contains allicin, a compound with antimicrobial properties, making it an effective treatment for certain infections when applied topically or consumed. Egyptian workers, including those who built the pyramids, were often given garlic as part of their rations, possibly as a preventative health measure, as much as a flavoring for their simple diets. The use of moldy bread on wounds might seem primitive, but it represents an early form of antibiotic therapy. Certain molds, including some that commonly grow on bread, produce compounds similar to penicillin. While Egyptian physicians couldn't have understood the mechanism, they observed that applying moldy bread to infected wounds sometimes led to improvement, and this effective practice became codified in their medical texts. But practical remedies were never enough. Prayers, charms, and spells whispered over your body were equally essential components of treatment. Amulets of specific shapes, made from particular materials, were prescribed for different ailments. Lapis lazuli scarabs for heart problems, red jasper for bleeding issues, green stone for gastrointestinal distress. These were not mere placebos in the Egyptian understanding, but vital channels for divine intervention. Magico-medical papyri contain elaborate instructions for the precise words to be spoken over patients, sometimes specifying the time of day, the direction the patient should face, or the specific deities to be invoked. These weren't viewed as separate from real medicine, but as necessary components, activating or enhancing the physical remedies. A headache might earn you an onion poultice and a long chant to ward off evil spirits. The treatment would be administered by a practitioner who might be called a SWNW, physician, Wab, purification priest, or So, magician, depending on the context and specific approach. Though in practice, these roles often overlapped. The healer would first diagnose by examining the patient and asking about symptoms, then classify the condition according to its perceived origin. For headaches believed to result from excessive heat in the head, cooling applications like onion poultices, onions were thought to have cooling properties, might be applied to the temples or forehead. Simultaneously, Incantations addressing headache demons might be recited, often invoking protective deities like Sekhmet, herself associated with both disease and healing. Medical papyri show real knowledge of anatomy, but also a deep fear of the unseen. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus demonstrates surprisingly accurate descriptions of the brain, spinal cord, and their relationship to motor function based on observations of battlefield and construction accident injuries. Cases are presented systematically with examinations, diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments outlined in a remarkably scientific approach. Yet alongside this empirical knowledge existed profound uncertainty about internal organs and processes that couldn't be directly observed in the living. The heart was recognized as a central, vital organ, but was also believed to be the seat of thought, emotion, and moral character. The brain, despite being accurately described anatomically, was not recognized as the center of cognition, but was considered relatively unimportant, explaining why it was removed during mummification. While the heart was carefully preserved, treatment was physical and spiritual. Healing, when it came, was as much about the favor of the gods as the skill of the healer. This integrated approach meant that recovery from illness was never attributed solely to medical interventions, but was understood as the result of a complex interplay between human actions and divine favor. If you recovered, you might make offerings at the temple of Imhotep or Sekhmet, healing deities who had intervened on your behalf. If treatments failed, this too had dual explanations. Perhaps the remedy was incorrectly prepared, or perhaps the gods had determined it was your time to journey to the afterlife. Either way, the integrated worldview provided frameworks for understanding both recovery and death. Cultural richness. Amid hardship, despite the hardships, culture thrived. Music, dance, poetry, and storytelling were cherished. Even in poor homes, someone might beat a drum or pluck a stringed instrument to pass the long, hot evenings. The instruments themselves represented significant technological and artistic achievement. Harps evolved from simple curved designs to elaborate ornate pieces with multiple strings capable of producing complex harmonies. Flutes, crafted from reeds or bone, required precise measurements to produce specific tones. Percussion instruments ranged from simple hand drums to the sistrum, a ritual rattle associated particularly with the goddess Hathor, its jingling sound believed to please the deities and drive away negative forces. Professional musicians held special status, particularly those attached to temple complexes or royal households. They underwent years of training, learning not just how to play instruments, but also the sacred or ceremonial music appropriate for different contexts. Wall paintings show bands of musicians performing together, suggesting developed musical traditions with ensemble playing rather than just solo performances. For common people, music making was more informal, but no less meaningful. Work songs helped coordinate group efforts and establish rhythms that made repetitive tasks more bearable. Lullabies soothed children to sleep. Celebration songs marked life milestones, from birth to marriage to death. The music itself generally followed pentatonic scales, with rhythmic complexity rather than harmonic sophistication being the primary focus. Children learned songs as part of their cultural education. Simple tunes taught them about the Nile's flooding cycle, the major deities, proper behavior, or practical skills. These musical teachings formed part of the oral tradition that preserved and transmitted culture across generations, particularly crucial in a society where literacy was limited to a small percentage of the population. Elders told stories. Oral storytelling served multiple functions. Entertainment, certainly, but also education, preservation of historical memory, and reinforcement of cultural values. Tales of the gods explained natural phenomena and established moral frameworks. Historical narratives about great pharaohs or notable events maintained collective memory. Fables featuring animals taught practical wisdom and ethical lessons in accessible forms. The tales of wonder, preserved in the Westcar Papyrus, give us a glimpse of the kind of stories that might have been told around evening fires. They feature magic, royal intrigue, and clever protagonists, suggesting that ancient Egyptians enjoyed narratives not so different from those that captivate modern audiences. These stories weren't static, but evolved with each telling incorporating new elements while maintaining core themes. Storytellers were valued for their memory, creativity, and performance skills, their ability to use voice, gesture, and timing to bring narratives to life. The best became known throughout their communities, requested at gatherings and celebrations for their particular specialties or signature tales. There was joy here, quiet, persistent, and often humble. Social gatherings centered around significant life events, births, coming-of-age ceremonies, marriages, funerals, each with its own traditional celebrations that brought communities together despite the challenges of daily life. Festival days provided a respite from routine labor and opportunities for shared experience across social classes. Religious festivals, like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, when families would visit the tombs of deceased relatives for ritual meals combining commemoration with celebration, or the Festival of Drunkenness, honoring the goddess Hathor with music, dance, and ritual intoxication, created spaces for emotional release and communal bonding. Even daily meals could become occasions for simple pleasure and connection. The evening meal, when family members gathered after completing the day's tasks, allowed for conversation, storytelling, and the small joys of shared food, however simple it might be. Contemporary sources suggest that Egyptians valued these moments of togetherness, seeing them as essential to a well-lived life despite material constraints. Play wasn't reserved only for children. Adults engaged in board games like Senet and Mehen, throwing games testing skill and accuracy, or athletic competitions during festival days. These activities provided not just entertainment, but opportunities for social interaction, friendly competition, and mental stimulation. Beyond the physical demands of daily labor, artisans carved scenes into tombs. Scribes copied tales onto papyrus, priests staged grand religious dramas. Entertainment was intertwined with devotion. The tomb artists worked in teams with specialized roles: master artists who outlined figures and scenes, apprentices who filled in colors, specialists who created inscriptions. Their work was considered essential for the deceased's afterlife, creating a permanent record of the ideal life the tomb owner wished to experience eternally. Working by the dim light of oil lamps or reflected sunlight channeled into tomb corridors through cleverly positioned white cloths, these artists created masterpieces using simple tools: reed brushes, mineral and plant-based pigments, and measuring cords to ensure proper proportions. Their techniques were taught through apprenticeship systems, with distinctive schools or styles traceable in different regions or time periods. The scenes they created weren't random, but followed established conventions that evolved slowly over centuries. Human figures were shown with heads and limbs in profile, but torsos from the front, a composite view that conveyed maximum information rather than realistic perspective. Size indicated importance, with the tomb owner depicted larger than family members, who in turn appeared larger than servants. Scribes occupied a privileged position in a society where perhaps 1% of the population could read and write. Their training began around age 5 and continued for up to 12 years, during which they mastered not only the complex hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, but also mathematics, administration, and religious texts. The profession was primarily passed from father to son, though there are instances of women working as scribes, particularly in temple or palace contexts. The physical toll of their work is visible in skeletal remains, distinctive patterns of arthritis in the hand, wrist, and shoulder from holding the writing palette and repeatedly dipping, controlling, and applying the reed pen to papyrus or ostraca, pottery fragments used for notes or practice. Their work varied widely: recording tax assessments in villages, inventorying temple or palace storehouses, copying religious or literary texts for preservation, drafting letters for illiterate individuals, creating administrative records for military campaigns or construction projects. Every significant activity in Egyptian society required scribal involvement to document, organize, and preserve information. Religious dramas represented some of the most elaborate public performances in ancient Egypt. During festivals like the Hebsed Royal Jubilee or the annual Opet Festival at Luxor, priests would enact sacred narratives depicting the lives, deaths, and rebirths of deities. These weren't merely theatrical entertainment, but were believed to have real cosmological effects. The proper performance of the Osiris mysteries, for example, was considered necessary for the continued fertility of Egypt and the successful rebirth of the dead. These performances combined multiple art forms: ritual movement, music, recitation of sacred texts, elaborate costumes and masks representing deities, and precisely timed interactions with the sun or stars at specific points in the ritual. Some took place within temple complexes, visible only to priests and perhaps high-ranking nobility, while others proceeded through city streets as processions, allowing broader public participation. Philosophy, in the abstract sense, wasn't as emphasized as in, say, Greece. But the Egyptians had a worldview, a concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and truth, that underpinned every law, ritual, and interaction. Ma'at wasn't just an abstract principle, but was personified as a goddess, typically depicted as a woman, wearing an ostrich feather on her head. This feather became the symbol of truth and righteousness, the weight against which the heart of the deceased would be measured in the final judgment. The concept encompassed multiple meanings: truth, justice, balance, harmony, order, and rightness. It applied at cosmic levels: the orderly progression of the sun, the reliable flooding of the Nile, the cycles of stars and seasons, but also governed human affairs, from the grandest state policies to the most intimate personal interactions. Maintaining Ma'a was considered the primary duty of the pharaoh, whose royal rituals and governance were meant to uphold cosmic order. But every Egyptian shared responsibility for upholding Ma'at through ethical behavior, fulfillment of social obligations, and proper religious observance. Disruption of Ma'at through crime, dishonesty, neglect of duties, or improper religious practice was understood to have consequences extending beyond the individual to affect family, community, and potentially the cosmos itself. The instructions, a genre of wisdom literature preserved on papyri and often used in scribal education, provided practical guidance for living in accordance with Ma'at. The instructions of Ptah-hotep, dating to the Old Kingdom, circa 2400 BCE, offers advice on topics ranging from table manners to business ethics to family relationships, all grounded in the understanding that right living maintains cosmic balance. Life wasn't about chasing happiness. It was about balance, about keeping the chaos at bay. The Egyptian worldview recognized existence as inherently precarious, with the ordered world constantly threatened by Isisfet, chaos, disorder, injustice. The habitable Black Land, the fertile Nile Valley, was surrounded by the hostile Red Land, desert. Life-giving water flowed through an otherwise arid landscape. Carefully developed agricultural systems could be wiped out by a flood that was too high or too low. Stable governance could dissolve into political fragmentation during the intermediate periods between strong dynasties. This awareness of precariousness fostered a profound appreciation for structure, ritual, and tradition as buffers against chaos. Innovation wasn't valued for its own sake, but was carefully integrated into existing frameworks. Disruption was feared rather than celebrated. Stability represented success, both personally and collectively. Yet within this seemingly conservative worldview existed recognition of life's inevitable changes and transformations. The central mythic narrative of Osiris, his death, dismemberment, reassembly, and rebirth, provided a template for understanding how destruction could lead to renewal, how apparent endings could transform into new beginnings. This pattern was reflected in natural cycles, the Nile's annual flood bringing new fertility, and human experience, preparation for death as preparation for a new form of existence. And even with balance, life in ancient Egypt wasn't for the faint of heart. There were no sick days, no mental health breaks, no retirement. You worked until your body stopped, and when it did, your journey wasn't over. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife evolved over the 3,000 years of their civilization, but certain core beliefs remained consistent. Death was not an end, but a transition. The deceased required material provisions for the journey and proper preparation. Both physical, mummification, and spiritual, funerary texts and rituals was essential for successful entry into the afterworld, death and the afterlife, because death was only the beginning, a final test. Your heart weighed against a feather, your soul judged, eternal peace if you passed, eternal nothing if you didn't. So, even in rest, the stakes were high. The journey began immediately at death. The Ba, one aspect of the soul depicted as a human-headed bird, could leave the body during the day, but needed to return to it each night. This necessitated preservation of the corpse through mummification, a process developed over centuries of experimentation and observation. For those who could afford it, mummification was elaborate. Removal of most internal organs, except the heart, believed to be the seat of personality and moral character. Dehydration of the body using natron salt for 70 days. Application of resins and oils. Wrapping in layers of linen interspersed with protective amulets, and placement in a series of coffins culminating in a stone sarcophagus. For the less wealthy, simpler methods were employed: basic evisceration, shorter natron treatment, fewer wrappings, simpler coffins. The poorest might simply be wrapped in reed mats and buried in the desert sand, where the hot, dry conditions provided natural mummification. The removed organs were preserved separately in canopic jars, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti, human-headed, guarded the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, the stomach. And Kebesenuef, falcon-headed, the intestines. The heart remained in the body, as it would be needed for the final judgment. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed at the tomb before sealing, ritually reanimated the mummy, restoring abilities to breathe, eat, drink, speak, and see in the afterlife. A priest touched the mummy's face with specialized tools while reciting appropriate spells, symbolically restoring these essential functions. Tombs were stocked with everything the deceased might need: food, drink, clothing, furniture, tools, weapons, jewelry, and cosmetics. For the wealthy, these would be actual items. For others, painted or carved representations or small models served the same purpose. Tomb walls were inscribed with offering formulas, invoking perpetual provisions for the deceased. The Book of the Dead, more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, provided a collection of spells to help navigate the afterlife journey. These weren't organized canonically, but were selected based on the individual's needs and resources. Common elements included spells for transformation, protection from dangers, knowledge of divine names, and passwords needed at various gates, and preparation for the final judgment. That judgment, vividly depicted in papyri and tomb paintings, took place in the Hall of Two Truths. The deceased's heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and cosmic order. 42 divine judges observed as the deceased recited the negative confession. denying having committed various sins. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not caused pain, I have not reduced the food offerings in the temples, and so on. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, recorded the verdict. If the heart balanced against the feather, the deceased was declared true of voice and allowed to proceed to the field of reeds, a perfect reflection of Egypt, where they would live eternally in abundance. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighted by sins and misdeeds, it would be devoured by Ammit, the terrifying devourer, with the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the back of a hippopotamus. This represented total annihilation, not punishment, but complete cessation of existence, a fate feared far more than any concept of hell. For those who successfully navigated judgment, eternal life awaited, not as disembodied spirits, but as complete beings engaging in idealized versions of earthly activities, farming perfect fields, hunting in lush marshes, feasting with family, sailing on clear waters. The afterlife wasn't remote or abstract, but a perfected version of the familiar world. The complexity and thoroughness of Egyptian preparation for death reflects not morbidity, but profound hope, belief in the possibility of eternal life, and determination to achieve it through careful preparation, ethical living, and proper ritual. It represented the ultimate triumph over the precariousness that characterized mortal existence, a permanent achievement of perfect balance and order. So no, you probably wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt, but they did, for centuries. Through flood and fire, through sun and sand, they endured. And maybe that's worth remembering as you drift off to sleep in your quiet room, your soft bed, your safe world. They dreamed of eternity. You just need a good night's rest. Chapter 4: Real Moments in Egyptian History. Let's drift through some slower currents in the Nile of time. The Great Pyramid, a monument to patience and engineering. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't just one of humanity's most ambitious building projects. It was also a monument to patience, planning, and a staggering amount of physical labor. Commissioned by the pharaoh Khufu, also known by his Greek name Cheops, during Egypt's Old Kingdom period, around 2600 BCE, the pyramid served as a tomb, a resting place fit for a god-king. It wasn't built by slaves, contrary to older myths, but rather by a rotating workforce of thousands of skilled laborers, craftsmen, and seasonal workers, most of whom were farmers during the off-season of agriculture. Archaeological excavations of workers' villages near the Giza Plateau have revealed far more humane conditions than previously imagined. Evidence of medical care for injuries, nutritionally adequate diets, including meat and organized housing with family units. These laborers were organized into crews and given housing, food, and even rudimentary medical care. Analysis of human remains from the workers' cemetery shows that broken bones were set and allowed to heal, indicating that injured workers were supported rather than discarded. Hieroglyphic graffiti inside the pyramid suggests that teams of workers competed with each other, taking pride in their contributions and identifying themselves with crew names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or Friends of Khufu. The logistics of the operation were as impressive as the engineering. Feeding thousands of workers required vast quantities of bread and beer, produced in specialized bakeries and breweries at the site. Copper tools had to be constantly resupplied and resharpened. Housing had to be constructed, maintained, and eventually expanded as the project continued over decades. The workforce wasn't static, but fluctuated seasonally, with larger numbers present during the agricultural off-season when the Nile flood made farming impossible. During these months, participating in pyramid construction provided both income and food for farmers who would otherwise have had no productive work. This ingenious system transformed what might have been economically dead time into the force that created Egypt's most enduring monuments. Stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons, were carved with copper tools, dragged over ramps, and hoisted into place using wooden sleds, ropes, and teamwork. The copper chisels and drills used to cut limestone would dull quickly, requiring frequent resharpening. Dolerite balls, harder stone, were used as hammers to pound rough shapes before finishing with finer tools. Sand served as an abrasive to polish surfaces to their final smoothness. They worked in the blistering sun, using trial and error, geometric instinct, and endless repetition. The precision achieved without modern surveying equipment is astonishing. The base of the Great Pyramid is level within just 2.1 centimeters, and its sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an average error of less than 0.06 degrees. These measurements suggest not just careful work, but profound mathematical understanding and sophisticated techniques for transferring design to actual construction. The internal chambers and passages show equally impressive engineering. The Grand Gallery, leading to the King's Chamber, features corbelled walls that narrow as they rise, creating a stable structure while providing interior space, a technique that distributes weight through compression. Above the King's Chamber, 5 stress-relieving chambers prevent the weight of stone above from crushing the ceiling of the burial chamber itself. There were no cranes, no steel, no machines, just muscle, planning, and the will to complete something colossal. Evidence suggests that blocks were moved using sledges pulled over surfaces made slippery with water, reducing friction. Experiments by modern archaeologists have demonstrated that this technique can reduce the required pulling force by up to 40%, making the movement of massive stones more feasible with human power alone. The pyramid consists of over 2 million limestone blocks, placed with such precision that even a knife blade can barely fit between them. The outer casing stones, most of which were removed in later periods for other construction, were polished white limestone that would have made the completed pyramid gleam brilliantly in the sunlight. The capstone may have been gilded, creating an effect of a massive monument crowned with a point of gold, catching the first and last rays of the sun each day. It took about 20 years to build. That's an entire generation's labor devoted to one man's afterlife. Records suggest construction began around the 2nd or 3rd year of Khufu's reign and was likely completed close to his death. This represents remarkable consistency of purpose and administration, maintaining the same massive project through 2 decades of changing circumstances, personnel, and challenges. But to the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new journey, and the bigger the tomb, the better the odds of being remembered by the gods. The pyramid wasn't merely a burial place, but a resurrection machine designed to facilitate the pharaoh's transformation and ascension. Its shape was symbolically significant. The sloping sides, thought to represent the rays of the sun, along which the king's soul could climb to join the divine realm. Nearby, smaller pyramids housed queens. These subsidiary pyramids, though modest compared to the Great Pyramid, would themselves be considered major monuments in most other contexts. They reflect the importance of royal women in Egyptian cosmology and succession practices. Queens weren't merely consorts, but essential participants in maintaining cosmic order through their association with goddesses like Isis and Hathor. Vast cemeteries surrounded the site, with workers buried in honor near the great structure they helped raise. The necropolis was designed as a complete city for the dead, with streets, districts of varying status, and infrastructure to support the ongoing cult activities that would sustain the deceased in the afterlife. Priests would maintain daily offerings in the associated temples for centuries, creating an economy of death that paralleled the economy of the living. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a symbol, a ladder to the heavens, a visible reminder that Egypt's strength lay not only in its power, but in its people's ability to unite and endure. The Great Pyramid served multiple cultural functions. It demonstrated the absolute authority of the pharaoh, who could command such vast resources. It provided tangible evidence of Egypt's organizational capabilities and technological sophistication. It created a permanent landmark visible for miles around, establishing the site as sacred space, and it employed thousands during its construction, integrating them into a project of national significance that transcended their individual villages and identities. And so it stands today, still defying time, wind, and curiosity. The Great Pyramid is a whisper across millennia, a sign that human hands, when guided by shared belief and patient effort, can shape stone into eternity. Despite over 4,500 years of exposure to the elements, looting, and the removal of its outer casing stones, the structure remains largely intact, a testament to the quality of its engineering and construction. It stands as the sole survivor of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, outlasting all other entries on that illustrious list. Modern visitors experience only a shadow of its original appearance. The smooth, white limestone casing that once covered the entire structure was removed over centuries, used as building material for bridges, mosques, and fortifications in Cairo. The surrounding complex of temples, smaller pyramids, and ceremonial ways has been significantly degraded. Yet even in its weathered state, the Great Pyramid continues to impress with its sheer mass, precise construction, and the ambition it represents. Akhenaten's religious revolution, another turning point, came much later, during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled in the 14th century BCE. Originally crowned as Amenhotep IV, This pharaoh of the 18th dynasty initiated perhaps the most dramatic religious and cultural revolution in ancient Egyptian history. He did something unheard of. He tried to change Egypt's entire religious system. For thousands of years, Egyptians worshipped many gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Anubis, and dozens more. Each deity had specific domains, personalities, and myths. Their interactions explained natural phenomena, justified social structures, and provided frameworks for understanding human experience. Temples throughout Egypt housed these various gods, each with their own priesthoods, rituals, and resources. But Akhenaten introduced the worship of one god only, Aten, the sun disk. This wasn't merely adding another deity to the pantheon or elevating an existing god to prominence. It was a fundamental reimagining of Egyptian cosmology. The Aten wasn't portrayed in human or animal form, like traditional Egyptian deities, but as the physical sun disk with rays ending in hands, often extending Ankh symbols, representing life to the royal family. The transformation wasn't overnight, but evolved over the first years of his reign. Initial monuments showed traditional religious imagery, but gradually the focus narrowed to the Aten. Around his 5th regnal year, he changed his name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, signaling his complete commitment to the new religion. This shift wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The traditional priesthoods, particularly those of Amun, had grown immensely powerful, controlling vast wealth and influencing state policy. By eliminating these cults, Akhenaten effectively neutralized these power centers, centralizing authority in the royal person as the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine. No longer did Egyptians approach their gods through local priests. Now, the path to divine blessing ran exclusively through the pharaoh. Akhenaten moved the capital to a new city. He built, from scratch, Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. Located on virgin soil in Middle Egypt, this new capital represented a clean break from traditions centered at Thebes and Memphis. The site was chosen because it formed a natural amphitheater surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides, where the sun rose between 2 peaks, a physical landscape that complemented the solar theology of the Aten cult. The city was designed around open spaces, with wide streets and numerous temples, characterized by open-air courtyards that allowed unfiltered sunlight to touch altars directly. The royal palace and administrative buildings dominated the central city, with residential neighborhoods for elites near this core and workers' villages at the periphery. Archaeological evidence suggests it was built hastily, with many structures showing signs of rapid construction and later modification. Art changed dramatically under Akhenaten's influence. Traditional Egyptian art had followed strict conventions for thousands of years. Humans depicted with heads and limbs in profile, but shoulders facing forward, standardized body proportions, and highly formalized compositions. The Amarna style that developed under Akhenaten broke these conventions with elongated faces, slender limbs, pronounced bellies, and more naturalistic poses. Sculptures showed the royal family in more relaxed poses, even playing with their children. Family affection became a central artistic theme. with numerous scenes depicting Akhenaten, his principal wife Nefertiti, and their daughters in intimate, casual interactions, kissing, sitting on each other's laps, or holding hands. These scenes were unheard of in previous royal iconography, which emphasized dignity and formal roles rather than personal relationships. The pharaoh wasn't just divine anymore, he was human too. This dual emphasis on Akhenaten's divine role as sole intermediary to the Aten and his human relationships created a complex theological message. He was simultaneously God's representative on earth and a model human, living in accordance with the natural order established by the Aten. But monotheism didn't sit well with most Egyptians. The Aten religion focused primarily on the royal family, offering little for common people who had relied on local deities for protection, healing, and guidance. There's little evidence that the new religion ever penetrated deeply into Egyptian society beyond the court circle and administrative elite. The priests, especially those of the powerful god Amun, lost influence. Temples were shut down. Centuries-old rituals vanished almost overnight. The economic impact was substantial. Temple complexes had been major employers, landowners, and centers of redistribution. Their closure disrupted established patterns of employment, education, and social services across Egypt. Evidence suggests that while official religion focused exclusively on the Aten, many ordinary Egyptians continued private worship of traditional deities. Household shrines to Bes, protector of childbirth, Taweret, guardian of women and children, and other popular gods, persisted throughout the Amarna period, indicating that the religious revolution remained primarily an elite phenomenon that never fully displaced folk practice. People were confused, uncertain, and perhaps even fearful. The traditional gods had guided Egyptian life for millennia, explaining everything from the Nile's flood to successful harvests to personal fortune or tragedy. Their sudden official absence left a conceptual void that the abstract Aten, described in texts as remote and universal, rather than personally involved with human affairs, couldn't easily fill. After Akhenaten's death, the traditional gods came rushing back. His successor, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, reversed the changes, restored the temples, and erased much of Akhenaten's legacy. The restoration stela, erected early in Tutankhamun's reign, describes Egypt under Akhenaten in dire terms, claiming that the gods had turned their backs on this land, and that temples had fallen into disrepair, their rituals forgotten. For a long time, his name was left out of king lists. In the 19th dynasty, under pharaohs like Seti the Mud and Rameses II, Akhenaten and his immediate successors were systematically omitted from official chronologies, their monuments dismantled, their names hacked from inscriptions. This damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, was so effective that Akhenaten was essentially unknown to history until 19th century archaeologists began uncovering evidence of his reign. His monuments were destroyed, stones from Amarna temples and palaces repurposed for later construction projects. The city of Akhetaten itself was largely abandoned within a decade of Akhenaten's death, its population relocating to traditional centers as the court returned to Thebes. The once grand capital reverted to desert, its mud brick structures crumbling back into the sand from which they were formed. Egypt, it seemed, had rejected the experiment. The rapid and complete reversal of Akhenaten's religious policies suggests that they never gained widespread acceptance, remaining an elite imposition rather than a genuine cultural shift. The traditional religious system, with its diverse, accessible deities and established infrastructure of temples and priesthoods, provided stability and meaning that the abstract solar monotheism of the Aten could not replace. Still, Akhenaten's moment left a mark. He was one of the first in recorded history to advocate a single god over many. The great hymn to the Aten, attributed to Akhenaten himself, expresses theological concepts that seem remarkably modern in some aspects. A universal creator deity, concern for all nations and peoples, and emphasis on the natural world as evidence of divine power and beneficence. Some scholars have suggested connections between Atenism and later monotheistic religions, particularly noting that Moses and the Israelites may have been in Egypt during or shortly after the Amarna period, potentially influenced by its religious ideas. While direct connections remain speculative, the parallels in some theological concepts are striking enough to merit consideration. His bold, brief revolution in faith shows how even a society built on tradition could be shaken by one man's vision, and how easily it could revert when that vision ended. The Amarna period serves as a fascinating case study in the limits of top-down cultural change, revealing that even absolute monarchs face constraints when attempting to reshape deeply ingrained religious beliefs and social practices. The archaeological record at Amarna provides an unusually clear snapshot of a specific historical moment, much like Pompeii, though for different reasons. Because the city was occupied for less than 20 years and then largely abandoned, it presents an uncontaminated view of daily life during this specific period, without the usual layers of later occupation that complicate most ancient sites. This has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct not just elite religious practices, but ordinary domestic activities, craft production, and social organization during this pivotal moment in Egyptian history. Recent excavations at Amarna have revealed a darker side to Akhenaten's utopian religious city. The South Tombs Cemetery has yielded skeletal remains showing signs of nutritional stress, high rates of childhood mortality, and evidence of demanding physical labor that damaged spines and joints. These findings suggest that while the royal family might have been experiencing a spiritual renaissance, many of those constructing and maintaining the new capital endured harsh conditions and physical hardship. Nevertheless, the brief Amarna period produced artistic and literary works of remarkable beauty and originality. The naturalistic depictions of plants and animals in temple reliefs, the tender family scenes in palace art, and the lyrical religious compositions, like the hymn to the Aten, represent creative high points in Egyptian cultural production. The period's innovations, though officially rejected, subtly influenced subsequent Egyptian art, which never quite returned to the rigid formality of pre-Amarna conventions. Cleopatra, Egypt's last pharaoh. And then, at the twilight of Egypt's ancient glory, came Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian by blood, but Greek, descending from Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great, who established himself as ruler of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty had governed Egypt as foreign rulers, maintaining Greek culture and language while adopting Egyptian religious forms and royal imagery to legitimize their rule. By Cleopatra's time, the dynasty had become more fully integrated with Egyptian traditions than its founders. While previous Ptolemaic rulers had rarely bothered to learn the Egyptian language, relying on interpreters to communicate with the majority of their subjects, Cleopatra mastered not only Egyptian, but reportedly 6 additional languages. This linguistic facility allowed her to communicate directly with foreign ambassadors and with her own people without intermediaries, a powerful political tool in a multilingual Mediterranean world. She ruled a land that had already seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, a civilization ancient even in her time. When Cleopatra ascended the throne in 51 BCE, the Great Pyramid was already 2,500 years old. More time had passed between the pyramid builders and Cleopatra than has elapsed between Cleopatra and us. Egypt had been conquered repeatedly by Hyksos, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks, each leaving their mark on the culture while the underlying Egyptian civilization absorbed and survived these intrusions. The Egypt Cleopatra inherited was economically wealthy, but politically vulnerable. The fertile Nile Valley remained productive, supplying grain throughout the Mediterranean world. Alexandria, the capital founded by Alexander the Great and developed by the Ptolemies, stood as one of the ancient world's great cities, a center of learning with its famous library and museum, a commercial hub with its magnificent harbor, and a cosmopolitan melting pot where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other cultures intermingled. But her intelligence, political skill, and fluency in multiple languages made her stand apart from her predecessors. Unlike many of the later Ptolemaic rulers who had succumbed to palace intrigue or self-indulgence, Cleopatra demonstrated remarkable political acumen and personal discipline. Her education at Alexandria's intellectual institutions had prepared her with knowledge of literature, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Contemporary sources describe her not primarily for beauty, but for her charming wit, engaging conversation, and penetrating intelligence. Cleopatra navigated a volatile world. Rome was growing stronger, and her kingdom needed powerful allies. The Roman Republic, though itself in the throes of civil conflict that would eventually transform it into an empire, had become the dominant Mediterranean power. Egypt's wealth made it an attractive potential province, its grain resources a strategic prize, and its independent status increasingly anachronistic in a world falling under Roman hegemony. Her famous relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were as much political as personal. With them, she hoped to protect Egypt's sovereignty and perhaps expand its influence. Her first political masterstroke came in 48 BCE, when she had herself smuggled into the royal palace, some sources say rolled in a carpet, to meet Julius Caesar, who was in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey. The alliance formed that night, both political and romantic, would secure her position on the throne against her brother, co-ruler Ptolemy III. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra consolidated her rule and gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XIII. Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, or Little Caesar, whom she claimed was Caesar's child and thus a potential bridge between the Egyptian monarchy and Roman power. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE left her position precarious once again. As Rome descended further into civil war between Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, and the triumvirate of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and others, she was more than a seductress. She was a strategist. Her alliance with Mark Antony, formalized in 41 BCE and later transformed into marriage, though Rome never recognized the union, represented another calculated effort to secure Egyptian independence through association with Roman power. With Antony, she produced 3 more children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus, creating potential dynastic connections throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. She managed crises, restored finances, and led her navy into battle. Under her administration, Egypt's economy stabilized. After the decline under her father, Ptolemy the Protheus, she reformed taxation, encouraged agricultural development, and maintained Alexandria's position as a center of trade and intellectual activity. Naval forces under her command fought alongside Antony's fleet, and contemporary accounts suggest she personally sailed with her forces, highly unusual for a woman in the ancient world. But the tides of history were against her. After Antony's defeat by Octavian, later Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where the combined Egyptian-Roman fleet commanded by Antony and Cleopatra failed to break Octavian's naval blockade, the couple retreated to Alexandria. As Octavian's forces approached the city in 30 BCE, Antony, believing a false report that Cleopatra had already killed herself, attempted suicide by sword, inflicting a mortal wound. According to Plutarch's account, he was brought to Cleopatra's monument, where she had taken refuge, and died in her arms. Her death, legend says by cobra bite, marked not just the end of her life, but the end of Egypt's independence. Ancient sources differ on the exact means. Plutarch mentions a poisonous snake smuggled in a basket of figs. Other accounts suggest poison concealed in a hairpin or other implement. Whatever the mechanism, Cleopatra appears to have chosen suicide over the humiliation of being displayed in Octavian's triumph parade in Rome, where captured rulers were traditionally exhibited in chains before being executed or imprisoned. The symbolism of the cobra, if accurate, would have been deliberate and profound. The uraeus, the rearing cobra that adorned the brows of Egyptian royalty, represented the goddess Wadjet and divine protection of the pharaoh. Death by its venom would symbolically affirm Cleopatra's royal status, even in defeat, transforming execution into apotheosis through association with this royal emblem. The land of the pharaohs became a Roman province. Egypt, which had maintained at least nominal independence for nearly 3 millennia, despite various conquests and occupations, was formally annexed as a province of Rome. Octavian, now Augustus, established a unique administrative structure for Egypt, placing it under his personal control, rather than senatorial oversight, reflecting both its strategic importance as Rome's granary and its exceptional wealth. Cleopatra was the last in a long line of monarchs stretching back 3,000 years. Though not ethnically Egyptian, she represented the final chapter in a tradition of native rule, or at least independently governed territory, that had begun with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Narmer around 3100 BCE. After her, Egypt would not regain true independence until modern times, passing from Roman to Byzantine, to Arab, to Ottoman, to British control over the subsequent centuries. Her legacy is complicated. Ancient writers portrayed her through Roman eyes, sometimes admiring, often critical. Octavian's propaganda machine worked diligently to portray her as a foreign temptress who had corrupted virtuous Romans, particularly Mark Antony, with Oriental luxury and decadence. This characterization, amplified by Roman historians and poets seeking imperial favor, established the seductress image that has dominated popular imagination for centuries. Archaeological evidence offers a more nuanced view. Coins minted during her reign show not an idealized beauty, but a woman with distinctive features, a prominent nose, strong jaw, and determined expression consistent with contemporary descriptions, emphasizing her intelligence and presence rather than physical perfection. Recent underwater excavations in Alexandria's harbor have recovered architectural elements and artifacts from the palace quarter, submerged by earthquakes and rising sea levels, gradually revealing more about the physical world she inhabited. But today, we see her as a ruler who dared to stand up to an empire, a woman in a man's world, and a symbol of ancient Egypt's final breath. Modern scholarship has increasingly recognized Cleopatra as an effective ruler operating with limited options in an impossible geopolitical situation. Perhaps, if not for the rising tide of Roman imperialism, one who might have established a stable Ptolemaic Egyptian state, bridging Greek and Egyptian cultures. Her gender makes her story even more remarkable. In a Mediterranean world dominated by male rulers, she maintained her position through political acumen, strategic alliances, and personal charisma. Her ability to project royal authority while navigating gender expectations of both Egyptian and Greco-Roman cultures demonstrates remarkable adaptability and intelligence. As the last pharaoh, she represents a poignant endpoint to one of humanity's longest-lasting civilizations. Aspects of Egyptian culture would continue under Roman rule. Temples were still maintained, hieroglyphs still carved, and traditional religious practices continued, particularly in Upper Egypt, far from Alexandria. But political independence was lost, the royal tradition ended, and Egypt became a possession rather than a sovereign state, its wealth flowing to Rome rather than supporting native institutions. Queen Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, nearly 1,500 years before Cleopatra, another remarkable woman rose to Egypt's highest position, not as a queen, but as pharaoh herself. Hatshepsut, who ruled from approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE during the 18th dynasty, began as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, after the death of her husband Thutmose II. But rather than relinquishing power when the boy came of age, she took the unprecedented step of assuming full pharaonic titles and regalia, becoming not just a temporary caretaker, but a ruling king in her own right. This transition wasn't immediate, but evolved over several years, as Hatshepsut gradually adopted the traditional symbols of kingship: the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the false beard worn by male pharaohs, the royal titles and epithets, and the ceremonial clothing of the king. In official art, she was increasingly depicted with the muscular male body of a traditional pharaoh, though inscriptions usually maintained feminine grammatical forms when referring to her, creating a unique hybrid representation that acknowledged her female identity while asserting her royal authority. To legitimize this extraordinary position, Hatshepsut developed an elaborate theological justification. Temple reliefs depicted her divine birth, with the god Amun having taken the form of her father Thutmose I to impregnate her mother, thus making her of directly divine parentage. Other scenes showed her coronation with the blessing of the gods, emphasizing divine approval of her rule. These weren't merely propagandistic fabrications, but reflected genuine theological concepts about the nature of kingship in Egyptian thought. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, but a critical connection between humanity and the divine realm. Under Hatshepsut's rule, Egypt prospered. Her reign was marked by peace, economic growth, and ambitious building projects. Trade expeditions to distant lands, particularly the journey to Punt, likely located in the region of modern Somalia or Eritrea, brought exotic goods like myrrh trees, ivory, ebony, gold, and aromatic resins. These expeditions were commemorated in detailed reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, showing not only the goods obtained, but also depicting the people and landscape of this foreign land with remarkable ethnographic detail. Her greatest architectural achievement, the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, remains one of ancient Egypt's most innovative and elegant structures. Set against the dramatic backdrop of the Theban cliffs, its series of terraces with colonnaded porticos represented a significant departure from traditional temple design, emphasizing horizontal lines and creating a sense of harmony with the natural landscape. The temple's skilled integration with its environment demonstrated not just engineering prowess, but artistic sophistication and a new architectural vision. Hatshepsut maintained the fiction that she ruled jointly with her stepson Thutmose III, who was gradually being prepared for his eventual role as sole pharaoh. Inscriptions from the period sometimes show them acting together, though real power clearly resided with Hatshepsut. This arrangement appears to have functioned smoothly for 2 decades. Thutmose received military training and eventually led campaigns, while Hatshepsut managed domestic affairs and religious institutions. After her death, however, Thutmose III eventually ordered the systematic removal of Hatshepsut's name and image from monuments throughout Egypt. This wasn't immediate. Evidence suggests it began around year 42 of his reign, approximately 20 years after her death, and appears to have been motivated more by dynastic concerns than personal animosity. By eliminating evidence of her rule, Thutmose created a direct line of succession from his father to himself, obscuring the unprecedented female king who had disrupted the traditional pattern. This attempt at historical erasure was largely successful. Hatshepsut's existence was forgotten until the 19th century CE, when archaeologists began deciphering hieroglyphics and uncovering her monuments, the discovery of her story revealed not just an exceptional individual, but evidence that the seemingly rigid gender distinctions of ancient societies could, under certain circumstances, prove more flexible than previously imagined. The Battle of Kadesh, ancient diplomacy. The ancient world witnessed its share of epic military confrontations, but few are as well documented or had such far-reaching diplomatic consequences as the Battle of Kadesh, fought in approximately 1274 BCE between the forces of Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire under King Muwatalli II. This clash near the Orontes River in what is now Syria represents the first battle in history for which detailed tactical accounts survive. The conflict arose from competition for control of trade routes and valuable territories in the Levant, with both Egyptian and Hittite empires seeking to extend their influence in the region. After securing his position in southern territories, Ramesses led his army northward to challenge Hittite control of Kadesh, a strategically located city that had previously switched allegiance between the two powers. The Egyptian force was substantial, divided into 4 divisions named after major deities: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Each contained approximately 5,000 men, supported by chariotry units and auxiliary troops. They marched in column formation through difficult terrain, vulnerable to ambush, a vulnerability the Hittites would exploit to devastating effect. Approaching Kadesh, Ramesses encountered 2 Bedouin tribesmen who claimed the Hittite army was still far away near Aleppo. This information, deliberately planted by the Hittites, led the pharaoh to push forward with only the Amun division, leaving the others to catch up. It was a near-fatal error, as Ramesses established his camp northwest of Kadesh. The main Hittite force, including some 3,500 chariots, was actually hidden behind the city, poised to attack. The subsequent ambush threw the Egyptian forces into chaos. Hittite chariots struck the unsuspecting Ra division as it marched toward the camp, shattering its formation and sending survivors fleeing toward Ramesses' position. With the camp under assault and only 1 division at full strength, the Egyptian position appeared hopeless. What happened next became the centerpiece of Ramesses' propaganda for the rest of his reign. According to Egyptian accounts, the pharaoh personally led a counterattack, charging into the Hittite forces with only his personal bodyguard. "I found 2,500 chariots, in whose midst I was," declares the text, carved on multiple temple walls. "But I was alone, no other with me." The text describes Ramesses calling upon his father Amun for support, then fighting with superhuman courage, single-handedly turning the tide until his troops could regroup. The reality was likely more complex. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the arrival of Egyptian reinforcements, a contingent of troops from Canaan, known as the Nearin, who approached from a different route, was crucial in preventing total defeat. The battle eventually ended in a stalemate, with the Hittites withdrawing after heavy losses on both sides. Ramesses claimed total victory in his monumental inscriptions, but the fact that Kadesh remained under Hittite control tells a different story. Most remarkable about this conflict, however, was its diplomatic aftermath. After several more years of inconclusive fighting, Ramesses II and the new Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated what is now recognized as one of history's earliest surviving peace treaties. Inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, the treaty established boundaries between their empires, arranged for extradition of political refugees, and committed both powers to mutual defense against external threats and internal rebellions. The Egyptian-Hittite treaty was further cemented by royal marriage. In his 34th regnal year, Rameses married a Hittite princess, daughter of Hattusili III, who took the Egyptian name Ma-thorn-Ferrer upon joining the pharaoh's household. This diplomatic marriage was celebrated in commemorative scarabs and stelae distributed throughout Egypt, emphasizing the new peaceful relationship between former enemies. The peace established by this treaty proved remarkably durable, lasting until the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1190 BCE due to multiple factors, including the invasions of the mysterious Sea Peoples and internal political strife. This period of stability allowed for increased trade and cultural exchange between the two powers, each influencing the other's artistic styles, technologies, and diplomatic practices. The end of an era, the decline of ancient Egypt. No civilization lasts forever, and ancient Egypt, despite its remarkable longevity, eventually faced decline. The process wasn't sudden, but occurred over centuries, with multiple factors combining to transform and ultimately dissolve the distinctive culture that had endured for millennia along the Nile. The Third Intermediate Period, c. 1070-664 BCE, marked the beginning of fragmentation after the New Kingdom's imperial height. Upper and Lower Egypt often came under separate control, with Libyan-descended dynasties ruling in the north, Nubian kings in the south, and local princes establishing semi-independent territories throughout the country. Temple priesthoods, particularly those of Amun at Thebes, accumulated such wealth and power that they sometimes rivaled or surpassed royal authority. Foreign invasions accelerated this fragmentation. Assyrian forces under Esarhaddon conquered Egypt in 671 BCE, sacking Memphis and imposing tributary status. Though full Assyrian control proved short-lived, their incursions demonstrated Egypt's vulnerability and permanently altered its self-image as an impregnable kingdom protected by geography and divine favors. The Persian Empire under Cambyses II conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, incorporating it as a satrapy, province. Persian rule, the 27th dynasty in Egyptian chronology, attempted to respect local religious traditions while extracting substantial tax revenue. Native Egyptian revolts succeeded briefly in restoring independence during the 28th through 30th dynasties, 404-343 BCE. But Persian forces under Artaxerxes III reconquered the country in 343 BCE, beginning the short-lived 31st dynasty. Alexander the Great's arrival in 332 BCE marked another pivotal transition. Welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, he was acknowledged as pharaoh and founded Alexandria, which would become Egypt's new capital and the Mediterranean's preeminent city. After his death and the partition of his empire, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, established himself as ruler, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty that would govern Egypt until Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE. Under Ptolemaic and subsequent Roman rule, traditional Egyptian culture faced increasing pressure from Greek and later Roman influences, while temples continued to be built and decorated in traditional Egyptian style, with hieroglyphic inscriptions and relief carvings showing pharaonic imagery. The administrative language shifted to Greek and later Latin and Greek. Urban centers, particularly Alexandria, became predominantly Hellenistic in architecture, education, and culture. Economic patterns shifted as Egypt was integrated into larger imperial systems. Agricultural wealth that had previously supported native institutions now flowed outward to Rome as grain shipments. The complex temple-based economic system that had sustained Egyptian cultural practices for millennia gradually lost funding and influence, though major cult centers continued to operate. Traditional religious practices showed remarkable persistence despite these changes. Temples to Isis, Serapis, a syncretic Greek-Egyptian deity, and other Egyptian gods spread throughout the Roman world, demonstrating the enduring appeal of Egyptian spiritual concepts, even as their original context transformed. In Egypt itself, particularly in Upper Egypt, far from Alexandria, traditional cults continued with only gradual modifications. The spread of Christianity from the 1st century CE onward presented a more fundamental challenge to ancient Egyptian religion. By the late 4th century, when Emperor Theodosius III prohibited pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire, many Egyptian temples were closed or converted to churches. The Temple of Isis at Philae, near the southern frontier, remained an active pagan site until the 6th century CE, the last place where hieroglyphs were carved and traditional rituals performed. The final chapter in ancient Egyptian writing came with the last known hieroglyphic inscription at Philae, dated to 394 CE, and the last Demotic, a late cursive form of Egyptian writing, inscription at the same site in 452 CE. Knowledge of how to read these scripts was subsequently lost until Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of the Rosetta Stone in the 1820s. Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE under the Rashidun Caliphate brought Islamic culture and the Arabic language, completing the transformation. Coptic Christianity, which preserved elements of ancient Egyptian language and some cultural practices within a Christian framework, continued as the majority religion until gradually being supplanted by Islam over subsequent centuries. What ended wasn't just a political system, but a continuous cultural tradition stretching back over 3 millennia. The temples fell silent, the hieroglyphs became indecipherable, and the religious practices that had defined life along the Nile since pre-dynastic times faded into history. Yet even in decline, ancient Egyptian civilization left an indelible mark on human history, preserving its monuments, art, and concepts in forms that continue to fascinate and influence the modern world. Still awake? That's okay. Tonight, let's journey, not just through time, but across the Red Sea. Our destination, the land of Punt, a place of incense trees, baboons, and sun-drenched myth. And leading us there, one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers, Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Yes, Pharaoh. Not queen, not consort. Pharaoh. So pull the blanket up to your chin, close your eyes, and imagine the slow bobbing of a ship over ancient waters Hatshepsut wasn't your typical Egyptian monarch. She came to power around 1478 BCE during Egypt's 18th dynasty, and though she originally ruled as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, she eventually claimed the title of pharaoh herself. To legitimize her rule, she did what many rulers do. She told a story. She depicted herself as chosen by the gods, born of a divine conception between her mother and the god Amun. On temple walls, she appeared in the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh: kilt, headdress, and yes, the ceremonial beard. But make no mistake, this wasn't deception. This was strategy, and part of that strategy, trade. Because power wasn't just about monuments or war, it was about wealth, about showing the gods and your rivals that Egypt could reach across oceans. And so, Hatshepsut launched an expedition, one of the most ambitious trading journeys of the ancient world. Its destination, Punt. We don't know exactly where it was. Somewhere around modern Eritrea or Somalia, most believe. But to the Egyptians, Punt was magical, a place of riches, frankincense trees, exotic animals, a land of wonder. The ships used weren't war vessels. These were broad, flat-bottomed ships designed for cargo. Made of cedar, imported from Lebanon, they had huge square sails and a crew of rowers, 5 ships, each maybe 70 feet long, crewed by sailors, soldiers, translators, scribes, and emissaries. Imagine that launch, the Nile swelling with the season, the sun reflecting off polished bronze tools, the river teeming with life, then out into the open Red Sea. A rare voyage for this time. No GPS, no radar, just stars, currents, and courage. When they arrived in Punt, they were greeted not with battle, but with trade. The rulers of Punt welcomed them. Exchanges were made, gifts offered, trees were dug up, roots and all, to be replanted in Egypt. Hatshepsut wanted not just the incense, but the trees themselves to flourish in Egyptian soil. They brought back gold, ebony, ivory, exotic animals like baboons and panthers, and famously, 31 live incense trees. This wasn't just commerce, it was performance. It showed that Hatshepsut could command the resources of the known world. When the expedition returned, it was celebrated in grand style. At her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut had the story immortalized in stone. Carvings show ships, cargo, Puntites with braided beards and unusual hats. There's even a depiction of the Queen of Punt, short and round, possibly showing a medical condition, carved with surprising realism, and there it still stands. Over 3,000 years later, we can still see the scene as Hatshepsut wanted it told. Not a tale of war, a tale of trade, diplomacy, and ambition. Of course, not everyone loved her rule. After her death, many of her monuments were defaced or erased, possibly by Thutmose III when he came to full power. Her name was scratched from walls, statues toppled, but the expedition's reliefs survived. They whisper to us still, in a world that often glorified conquest, Hatshepsut chose connection. She ruled for over 2 decades. Egypt prospered, and instead of sword and shield, she left behind carvings of ships, trees, and a dream of distant lands. So if you're drifting now, Feel the gentle rhythm of wooden oars, the scent of incense trees, the quiet pride of a leader who turned trade into triumph. Still with me? Or maybe you're already half asleep, drifting gently on the breeze of the Nile. That's perfect, because where we're going tonight, there's no rush, just warm stone, ancient chants, and the long shadow of a king who refused to be forgotten. Tonight's dream is carved in sandstone. It's the story of Rameses II, Rameses the Great, builder of monuments, father of legacies, and a man who made time itself his canvas. So close your eyes, slow your breath. Ramesses Bresnon was born around 1303 BCE, and he lived a long, almost implausibly long life, into his 90s by some estimates. He reigned for 66 years, which in ancient times was practically an eternity. The world changed while he ruled. Generations were born and died. But Rameses remained, a living monument in a world where kings were usually dust by 40. He was the third pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty. But he didn't just inherit a kingdom, he elevated it. Ramesses didn't see himself as just a ruler. He was the sun's echo, a god among men, and he wanted Egypt and the gods to never forget. So he built and built and built. His name appears more times than any other pharaohs in the temples and tombs of Egypt. He added inscriptions to existing monuments, sometimes even claiming the work of others. But his greatest projects were undeniably his own: Abu Simbel, Ramesseum, Pi-Ramesses, Luxor expansions, Karnak additions. Each temple a breath of stone, each pillar a heartbeat in time. Let's start with Abu Simbel. Far to the south, near the border of Nubia, Ramesses ordered the construction of two massive temples carved directly into a sandstone cliff. This wasn't just a building, it was a message to Egypt's southern neighbors, a message to the gods, and maybe, quietly, a message to time itself. The Great Temple is the larger of the two. 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses flank the entrance, each nearly 70 feet tall. Their faces are calm, composed, divine. Inside, the halls stretch deep into the rock, lined with carved columns shaped like Ramesses himself. On the walls, scenes of his military campaigns, including the Battle of Kadesh, play out in vivid, stylized detail. It's both history and theater. Now, let's pause there for a moment. The Battle of Kadesh. It happened around 1274 BCE, between the Egyptians and the Hittites, two great powers of the ancient world. Ramesses led his army into what he expected would be a surprise attack. Instead, he found himself ambushed. For a time, it looked like disaster, but Ramesses rallied. He fought bravely, at least according to Egyptian sources, and turned the tide. The battle ended in a stalemate. Yet in Egypt's temples, it was portrayed as a glorious victory, a triumph of divine leadership. And that was the point. It didn't matter if it was technically true. What mattered was that it was eternal, carved in stone, told in song, glimpsed by flickering torchlight thousands of years later. Back at Abu Simbel, the smaller temple beside the great one was dedicated to his favorite wife, Nefertari. She wasn't the only wife. Ramesses had many, but she held a special place, and in this temple, she's depicted as equal in size to the pharaoh himself. That was rare, almost unheard of. Inside, the walls glow with images of Nefertari, offering to the gods, accompanied by Hathor, the cow-eared goddess of love, music, and motherhood. The carvings are delicate, rich with symmetry. You can almost feel the brush of incense, the softness of linen robes against sun-warmed stone. Now imagine this. Centuries later, the temples were buried by sand, hidden, forgotten, but not lost. In the 19th century, explorers rediscovered them, and in the 1960s, when the rising waters of the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge them forever, the temples were moved, stone by stone, to higher ground, an engineering miracle, an echo of Ramesses' own ambition. That's the power of stone, the power of story. Back in Thebes, Ramesses built his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. It was meant to be his legacy. There, he'd be worshipped for eternity. Statues once stood over 60 feet tall. Columns rose in forested ranks. And the walls? They told stories. Ramesses the warrior, Ramesses the builder, Ramesses the divine. Time wore it down. Earthquakes, tomb robbers, the slow grinding patience of wind and sun. But it still speaks. And then there was Pi-Ramesses, his capital in the delta. It was grand, sprawling, filled with palaces, stables, and markets. Built near the old Hyksos capital of Avaris, it symbolized renewal, power reclaimed. It's long gone now, lost beneath the soil. But at the time, it was the beating heart of the empire. Ramesses' reign saw prosperity. Building projects gave work to thousands. Trade flourished. Art thrived. Diplomacy, too. He signed one of the earliest known peace treaties with the Hittites. A copy still exists, etched in cuneiform and hieroglyph, a testament to words over war. He fathered over 100 children. His sons and daughters appear in procession after procession, their names engraved for eternity. Some died young, some became priests, a few ruled briefly after him, but none matched his shadow. When Ramesses finally died, he was buried in the Valley of the Kings. His mummy, later discovered, showed signs of arthritis and dental abscesses. He was old, very old, but still regal. And in death, as in life, he remained. Temples still bear his face. Statues still wear his crown. Stories still speak his name. The Greeks later called him Ozymandias. Percy Bysshe Shelley, centuries after that, imagined a broken statue in the desert. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. But despair doesn't fit here, because you, listening in your soft bed, are proof that his story lived. His face, carved in cliffside shadow, survived fire and flood. And here you are, hearing it now, breathing calmly, safe, still. So let the echoes of Ramesses cradle you. Let the stone turn soft. Let the centuries stretch long and slow. The Library of Alexandria, sanctuary of thought. You're not in Thebes tonight, not in Memphis or the Valley of the Kings. Tonight, you're in Alexandria, the city of scrolls, of scholars, of secrets, and at its glowing heart, the greatest library the ancient world ever dreamed into being. So rest easy, you're in good hands, or rather in good thoughts. Let's begin. The birth of a dream. It all started with a dream. After the death of Alexander the Great, in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy seized Egypt and crowned himself king. As part of building his capital, Alexandria, he sought not only power and prestige, but permanence. And what better way to outlive your body than through books? Have you ever breathed air perfumed with papyrus and ink? Ever felt the weight of knowledge press against your fingertips? Ptolemy did. He understood that armies conquer lands, but ideas conquer time. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building, it was an idea that all the world's knowledge could live in one place, that human thought could be gathered, copied, preserved, and shared. Built near the royal palace and the famed harbor, the library formed part of the Museion, a temple to the Muses, those mythical sisters of art and science. Inside, courtyards, lecture halls, botanical gardens, observatories, and somewhere between those quiet colonnades, shelves of papyrus scrolls. Lots of them, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. The collection, no one knows exactly how many. Some say 40,000. Some say 400,000. The truth has faded like ink on an old page. But we know this. It was the most ambitious collection of knowledge in antiquity. Imagine the vastness of it. Row upon row of cylindrical containers, each holding a scroll, each scroll containing someone's thoughts, observations, stories, calculations, each shelf a universe unto itself, each room a galaxy of human understanding. When you walked through the Museion, you weren't just walking through halls, you were traversing centuries, civilizations, the collected wisdom of Egypt's 30 dynasties, the mathematics of Babylon, the epics of Greece, the astronomy of Persia, the philosophies of India. To build that collection, the Ptolemies did something bold. They made it law that any ship docking in Alexandria must surrender its books. The scrolls were copied by trained scribes, the copies returned, the originals kept. That's how important knowledge was here. Worth seizing, worth storing, worth guarding. Sometimes the Ptolemies would borrow official copies of great works from Athens. They'd leave a hefty deposit in silver as surety. But when the manuscripts arrived in Alexandria, they'd keep the originals, return the copies, and forfeit the silver. To them, the authentic words of Aeschylus or Sophocles were worth more than chests of precious metal. The library gathered texts from Greece, India, Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, everywhere known. It wasn't just a Greek library, it was a global one. Works of science, poetry, religion, medicine, mathematics, epic poems and obscure treatises, star charts and plays, everything. Do you hear that? The whisper of 1,000 languages murmuring between the columns, Hebrew beside Aramaic, beside Egyptian hieratic script, beside Greek, words from lands that fought wars against each other, resting peacefully side by side on shelves of cedar. The scholars and the people who worked there, scholars, poets, dreamers, they lived and worked in the Museion, paid by the state, fed by the kitchen, housed among the columns. They debated, copied, taught, argued over commas. One of the most famous was Eratosthenes. He calculated the circumference of the earth using a well, a shadow, and some good geometry, and he was nearly spot on. Picture him for a moment, bearded perhaps, with eyes sharp from years of observation. On the solstice, he notes that in Siene, modern Aswan, the sun shines directly down a well at noon, casting no shadow. But in Alexandria, at the same moment, a vertical rod casts a shadow. From this difference, and knowing the distance between the cities, he calculated Earth's circumference within a few percent of our modern value. All this 1700 years before Columbus set sail. Then there was Hipparchus, refining astronomy. From a quiet rooftop observatory, he charted the positions of stars with such accuracy that he detected the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete a cycle. Every night, beneath the vast Egyptian sky, he added one more point of light to his growing map of the cosmos. Euclid, reshaping mathematics. His Elements established geometry as we know it. 13 books of pure logical beauty. Definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs. A structure so sound that it stood unchallenged for 2 millennia. In quiet rooms, students traced his diagrams in sand trays, discovering for themselves the eternal truths of circles, lines, and angles. Galen, recording medicine. He dissected animals, and perhaps humans, challenging ancient misconceptions about anatomy. His writings on the circulatory system, the nervous system, and physiology became the foundation of medical knowledge for the next 1,000 years. In rooms smelling of herbs and minerals, he taught students how to observe symptoms, prepare remedies, and understand the complex machinery of the human body. Herophilos, going further still, performed human dissections, something that would become taboo for centuries afterward. He discovered the difference between motor and sensory nerves, identified the prostate, named the duodenum. Through his careful studies, the human body began to reveal its secrets. Callimachus, the poet-librarian, compiling a catalog of all the scrolls, a sort of ancient Dewey Decimal System, called the Pinakies, or tables. It organized works by subject and author. For the first time in history, one could search for knowledge systematically. It wasn't just a library, it was a laboratory, a university, a sanctuary of thought. The atmosphere, there are quiet echoes that still hum beneath your pillow if you listen closely. A quill dragging across papyrus, the distant rustle of a tunic as a scholar stands from his bench to stretch, candlelight reflecting on wax tablets, the scent of dried ink mixed with dust and oil. The morning light in Alexandria has a particular quality. It enters the halls of the Museion slantwise, illuminating dust motes that dance like tiny planets in the beams. As the sun climbs, the marble columns warm, shadows retreat. The spaces between thought and thought grow bright. Imagine walking into one of its reading rooms. The air cool, even in summer. A clerk hands you a scroll, Plato, perhaps, or an Indian treatise on numbers. You sit cross-legged on a cushion, adjust the lamp near your elbow, and begin. As the words unfold, so does the world. Languages you've never heard before begin to sound familiar. Ideas that seem modern are older than you guessed. Thoughts someone else wrote long ago suddenly feel like your own. You aren't just in the Library of Alexandria, you're part of it. The scrolls themselves had a particular smell, papyrus, made from the pith of reeds that grew along the Nile, carries a sweet, earthy scent. The ink, often made from soot mixed with gum arabic, adds a sharper note. Unroll a scroll, and you release aromas trapped for decades. It's like opening a time capsule for your nose. And the sounds? The library wasn't silent. Whispers, yes, but also the occasional argument between scholars, debating a fine point of philosophy, the scratch of reed pens on fresh papyrus, the soft shuffle of sandals on stone floors, the distant call of gulls from the harbor. All these created a gentle symphony of learning, knowledge in practice. They weren't just collecting scrolls. They were translating them, comparing them, debating what truth even meant. Scholars here knew the earth was round, that it circled the sun. They studied human anatomy with a calm precision that wouldn't return until centuries later. They saw the stars not as omens, but as systems. In one corner of the Museion, Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, 800 years before Copernicus. He was largely ignored. Ideas sometimes need to wait for the world to catch up. In another room, Archimedes, visiting from Syracuse, might have sketched his ingenious machines. The screw pump, the compound pulley, the burning mirrors. Did he really shout "Eureka" in his bath? Perhaps, but here in Alexandria, such exclamations of discovery were commonplace. They also made mistakes. That's what makes it human. They argued, rewrote, and sometimes erased. They struggled to understand, but they kept asking. Consider Ptolemy, not the king, but the later astronomer. His geocentric model of the universe, with Earth at the center, was wrong. Yet his careful observations and mathematical models were so precise that they remained useful for navigation for 1,400 years. Even wrong theories can lead to right practices. Beyond facts, the library didn't only house facts. It held poetry, plays, myths. They understood that to know the world, you also had to feel it. Apollonius of Rhodes composed his Argonautica here, a retelling of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Between calculations of planetary motions and catalogues of medicinal herbs, epic verses took shape. The same hands that measured the stars also wrote of love, adventure, and the capricious gods. In quiet courtyards, actors might rehearse plays, ancient classics, and new works. Their voices carried into study rooms, mingling mathematics with mythology. No one complained. This wasn't seen as a distraction, but as part of the wholeness of learning. The library recognized no separation between the arts and sciences. Astronomy and poetry lived side by side. Medicine and music, mathematics and drama, all were pathways to understanding the cosmos and our place within it. Evenings in Alexandria were often filled with discussion. By lamplight, in courtyards under fig trees, voices mingled, questions and answers, arguments and laughter. Students sat beside masters, foreigners listened to locals, Greek met Egyptian, met Persian, met Hebrew. The Museion was a crossroads. Can you see them there? Clustered around low tables, wine mixed with water in simple cups, olives and bread and cheese, to sustain the body while ideas sustain the mind. One scholar gestures broadly, tracing the arc of a thought in the air. Another listens, head tilted, eyes narrowed in concentration. A third jots notes on a wax tablet. A fourth stares into the middle distance, seeing patterns invisible to the others. At times, the city itself seemed to swirl with thought. The translation project, one of the Museon's greatest achievements, was the Septuagint, the first translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, or so the story goes, worked on the task. Each translator was given a separate cell, the legend claims, and each miraculously produced identical translations, a divine sign of approval. The truth was likely less miraculous, but no less impressive. A carefully coordinated scholarly project bringing Hebrew wisdom into the Greek-speaking world. It marked the beginning of a tradition of translation that would eventually spread texts across languages, cultures, and time itself. This wasn't just an academic exercise. It was an acknowledgement that wisdom belongs to no single people or language. That truth, wherever found, deserves to be shared. Beyond the Septuagint, translators worked on countless other texts: Egyptian medical treatises, Persian astronomical tables, Indian mathematical concepts. As languages met and mingled, so did ideas. The concept of zero, the use of algebra, the precision of geometric proof, all flowed through Alexandria's scholarly bloodstream. Daily life in the Museion. What was it like to live and work at the Museion? For the scholars, days followed a rhythm dictated by light and learning. Dawn broke early over the Mediterranean. The first rays found some scholars already awake, astronomers concluding night observations, insomniacs feeding final thoughts to waiting scrolls. As the sun cleared the horizon, the Museion stirred to fuller life. Breakfast was simple: bread, olive oil, perhaps some fruit or cheese, eaten quickly, often while reading. The real feast was knowledge, and appetites for it ran high. Morning brought lectures. In open courtyards or columned halls, masters shared wisdom with circles of students. Some spoke from memory, others read from texts. The best combined both, adding personal insights to ancient wisdom. Did they use teaching aids? Certainly. Sand tables for drawing geometric figures, armillary spheres for demonstrating celestial motions, physical specimens from the botanical gardens or zoological collections. Learning engaged all senses. Midday meant rest for many, the Mediterranean custom of avoiding the harsh sun. Shutters closed, conversations quieted. Some slept, others continued private studies in shaded corners. The library's thick stone walls kept interior spaces tolerably cool even in summer heat. Afternoons were for practical work, copying texts, conducting experiments, compiling observations. Small groups collaborated on shared projects. Individual scholars pursued personal research. The scratch of reed pens on papyrus provided a constant undertone. As evening approached, the light changed, growing golden. Oil lamps were lit. The pace slowed. This was the time for conversation, for synthesis, for drawing together the day's scattered threads of thought. Dinner was communal, served in dining halls adjacent to the main library. More substantial than breakfast, fish, vegetables, bread, wine. Conversation flowed as freely as drink, though drunkenness was frowned upon. Clear thinking required clear heads, and then night. For most, sleep. For astronomers, the beginning of the real workday. For some philosophers, hours of quiet reflection. For poets, the muse often spoke most clearly in darkness. Through it all, the scrolls waited, patient, containing mysteries already solved and questions still unanswered. Each dawn, the cycle began again. The world outside, beyond the Museon's walls, Alexandria pulsed with life. Founded by Alexander, but built by the Ptolemies, it grew into the ancient world's most cosmopolitan city. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Nubians, Romans, all mingled in its streets and marketplaces. The great harbor bustled with ships from every corner of the known world. Grain from Egypt's fertile fields, spices from Arabia, silk from distant China, amber from the Baltic, gold from Nubia, and yes, books. Always books. The city's famous lighthouse, the Pharaoh, stood nearly 400 feet tall, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. By day, its mirror reflected sunlight to guide ships. By night, its fire burned, a constant star to sailors navigating the treacherous coastline. From the Museon's upper levels, scholars could gaze out over this vibrant cityscape. Did they feel removed from it, isolated in their ivory tower of thought? Perhaps some did, but many moved between worlds, teaching public classes, advising rulers, applying their knowledge to practical problems of engineering, agriculture, and governance. Knowledge flowed both ways. Sailors brought reports of distant lands. Merchants shared practical innovations. Physicians exchanged remedies with local healers. The library didn't just preserve wisdom, it created it through constant interaction with the living city around it. The decline, pharaohs came and went. Rome rose. But the library held firm for a while, and then it began to vanish. There's no single villain, no great fire with a clear start and finish. It may have started with Julius Caesar's siege, where some of the docks burned, or it may have been later, under Christian zealots or Muslim conquest. Some parts were destroyed, others were neglected. Still more may have simply crumbled as priorities shifted. The truth is more complex than the myths. The library didn't die in a single blaze of destruction. It faded like a text left too long in sunlight. During Caesar's Alexandrian War, 48 to 47 BCE, fire did damage some of the library's holdings. Plutarch writes that flames from burning ships spread to the docks and into warehouses where books were stored. How many were lost? We don't know. But it wasn't the end. The library continued, though perhaps diminished. Antony is said to have given Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from Pergamon to restore Alexandria's collection. The gift of knowledge. What greater token of love could there be? But Egypt's fortunes changed. Rome's grip tightened. Resources that once flowed to scholarship were diverted to more pressing concerns: war, governance, survival. Then came religious changes. As Christianity spread, attitudes toward classical learning shifted. Some early Christians valued the ancient wisdom. Others saw it as pagan, dangerous, best forgotten. Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, led the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, a temple that housed part of the library's collection. By the time Arab forces conquered Alexandria in 641 CE, what remained of the great library may have been scattered or diminished beyond recognition. The famous story of Caliph Omar ordering the books burned because they will either contradict the Quran, in which case they are heresy, or they will agree with it, in which case they are superfluous, is likely apocryphal, a legend that says more about medieval Christian views of Muslims than historical fact. Imagine a scroll stored too close to a damp wall. One day, the papyrus curls, the ink fades, and no one notices. Imagine a librarian reassigned, a shelf forgotten, dust settles, the knowledge sleeps. Loss doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. The legacy, but not everything was lost. Fragments survive, copies made elsewhere, ideas scattered like seeds on the wind. We remember the names of its thinkers, the shape of its rooms, the spirit of its mission. We remember that once a people believed that knowledge itself was sacred, that gathering understanding from every corner of the world was worth time, worth money, worth building for, worth protecting. When scholars fled Alexandria, they carried scrolls and, more importantly, ideas to Constantinople, to Damascus, to monasteries across Europe, to houses of learning in Persia and beyond. The flame divided but didn't diminish. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the University of Nalanda in India, the medieval universities of Bologna, Paris, Oxford, the Renaissance libraries of Florence, all carried echoes of Alexandria's dream. That knowledge could be gathered, preserved, shared. Even today, we invoke its name when we build archives, when we dream of preserving the internet, when we ask what humanity knows and what we've still to learn. Every time a child looks up at the stars and asks, why? Every time a scholar publishes findings for others to build upon. Every time a library opens its doors, free to all. Every time knowledge flows across borders, languages, cultures, the spirit of Alexandria lives. The modern Library of Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002 near the site of the ancient library. Its circular, tilted design evokes a rising sun, a new dawn of learning. Inside, millions of books in multiple languages, digital archives, art galleries, specialized libraries, conference spaces. Once again, Alexandria reaches for the dream of universal knowledge. But perhaps the truest heir to the ancient library isn't a building at all, but the internet itself, a vast, decentralized collection of human knowledge and creativity. Like its predecessor, it's imperfect, chaotic, contains wisdom alongside folly. Yet the dream persists that all human knowledge might be gathered in one place, accessible to all. The Library of Alexandria isn't just history, it's hope, the eternal flame. So as you drift now, imagine those scrolls, row upon row, wrapped in linen cords, labeled with tags, written in languages lost and found again. The rustle of papyrus as it unrolls, the whisper of a question asked 3,000 years ago and still waiting for an answer. Feel the cool stone beneath your feet. Hear the distant murmur of scholarly debate. Smell the mingled aromas of ink, papyrus, olive oil lamps, and the salt breeze from the harbor. This place may be gone, but it has never left us. In your dreams tonight, you might wander those lost corridors, run your fingers along cedar shelves, unroll a scroll of Sappho's poetry, her complete works, not just the fragments that survived. Read Aristotle's dialogues, now lost to time. Browse the missing books of Livy's History of Rome. The library never really burned. It transformed. Every time you ask why, you relight one of its lamps, and in that flicker, across centuries, it remembers you. Remember something else too. Libraries are vulnerable. Knowledge is fragile. What seems permanent can vanish. Digital archives can fail. Books can burn. Languages can be forgotten. Yet the human impulse to preserve knowledge, to pass it forward, proves remarkably resilient. Despite war, disaster, neglect, and intentional destruction, much of ancient wisdom has survived. Not all. We feel the ache of what's lost, but enough to remind us of what's possible. Sleep well, gentle scholar. May your dreams be filled with quiet rooms and minds alight. The night is long, but the flame endures. The obelisk that crossed oceans, welcome back, drifting listener. Tonight, we sail again, not on papyrus boats through Nile reeds, but on something more curious, across oceans, centuries after the pharaohs slept. You see, this is a story not of kings or tombs, but of a stone. Tall, elegant, ancient, an obelisk, a single needle of granite carved beneath the sun god's gaze, and centuries later, shipped to New York City. Yes, really. So, fluff your pillow. Let your breath slow like oars dipping into still water. This is a tale of sand, salt, silence, and the endurance of memory. Birth in stone, it began, like so many Egyptian stories, in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, a sacred site where obelisks rose like sunbeams turned to stone. Around 1450 BCE, Pharaoh Thutmose III ordered two great obelisks carved from red granite, quarried far to the south near Aswan. Imagine Aswan then, not the modern city with its dam and tourists, but a place of stone and sweat. The granite there, a peculiar rose-hued variety, was prized above all others. It held within it flecks of feldspar that caught the sun and winked like stars trapped in stone. The pharaohs believed this stone was infused with divine energy, a solid form of sunlight itself. The quarry workers approached their task with reverence, These weren't just laborers, but artisans, many of them descendants of families who had shaped Egypt's monuments for generations. Their tools were simple: dolerite hammers, bronze chisels, wooden wedges, rope, water. Their knowledge, passed from father to son, was profound. First, they had to find the right stone, a single piece of granite large enough for an obelisk, without cracks or flaws. Egyptologists believed they would wet the stone surface at dawn, watching how it dried as the sun rose. Imperfections would reveal themselves in the drying patterns. Once the perfect stone was located, they began the delicate work of separation. Picture them, swarming over the rock face like ants, creating a line of holes along the desired cut. Into these holes, they would drive wooden wedges, then soak them with water. As the wood expanded, it would create immense pressure, eventually splitting the granite along a clean line. The granite block, still rough, would then be shaped. Initial work done right there in the quarry. The obelisk, taking form within the stone, like Michelangelo would later say of his sculptures, that he merely removed the excess to reveal what was always there. Each stone weighed over 200 tons. Each was over 20 meters tall. They were cut, polished, inscribed with praise to the gods and to the pharaoh's glory. The hieroglyphs, deep and precise, told of Thutmose's victories, his divine lineage, his covenant with the sun god Amun-Ra. Carving these was itself a sacred act. Scribes would first paint the symbols, then master carvers would follow, chiseling with such precision that many cuts remain razor sharp even today. Then transported painstakingly to Heliopolis. That alone would have been a triumph. The first journey, imagine the planning. Engineers aligning stars and stone, workers dragging the monoliths across wooden rollers, Nile barges creaking beneath the weight. This wasn't construction, it was orchestration. The journey from Aswan to Heliopolis spanned over 500 miles, first overland to the Nile, then by barge downstream. How many hands touched the stone during this journey? Thousands, surely. How many prayers were whispered over it? Countless. The overland portion required a cleared path wide enough for the stone and its sledge. Trees removed, boulders cleared, the ground leveled and sometimes layered with wooden tracks. Ropes, thick as a man's arm and woven from palm fiber, stretched ahead with teams of workers pulling in coordinated heaves. Progress was measured in feet per day, not miles. Water was constantly poured on the track before the sledge to reduce friction. Priests walked alongside, burning incense, chanting prayers to ease the journey. Overseers called cadence for the pulling teams. A rhythm still echoed millennia later in sea shanties and work songs around the world. Reaching the Nile brought new challenges. A specialized barge had to be constructed, basically a floating platform with the obelisk secured across multiple hulls. The stone would have been loaded during the dry season when the river was low, then transported when the annual flood raised the water level, giving the barge clearance over sandbars. The Nile journey itself might have taken weeks, moving mostly with the current, but occasionally requiring rowing or towing from the banks when winds were unfavorable. Villages along the way would have witnessed this floating mountain passing, a visible demonstration of pharaonic power and divine favor. Arriving near Heliopolis, the obelisk had to be unloaded and dragged to its final position. A ramp of earth would have been built, allowing the stone to be pulled up and then positioned over its prepared base. As the ramp was removed, the obelisk would be gradually lowered into place, standing vertical for the first time since it left the living rock of Aswan. The obelisks stood for over 1,000 years. One was toppled, the other remained, a survivor among crumbling temples, its surface slowly worn by wind and time. Think of what it witnessed in those silent centuries: the end of New Kingdom glory, the Assyrian invasions, Persian rule, Alexander's conquest, the Ptolemies with their Greek ways, Cleopatra's love affairs and tragic end, Roman legions marching past its shadow, the rise of Christianity, the coming of Islam. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, the gods changed, the languages around the base changed, but the obelisk stayed, quiet and tall. Its hieroglyphs, once readable to any educated Egyptian, became mysterious symbols from a forgotten time. The knowledge of how to read them faded like footprints in desert sand. By the time Rome fell, few could decipher the stories carved on the obelisk's faces. By the medieval period, they were complete mysteries, believed by some to contain magical formulas or hidden wisdom from before the flood. The stone that had been created to speak to eternity had become mute, its voice lost to time, yet still it stood, silent sentinel, marking the passage of ages, a gift across oceans until 1880. That year, after much diplomacy and ceremony, Egypt offered the standing obelisk as a gift to the United States, not as loot or conquest, as gesture, a thank you for help in opening the Suez Canal and for supporting Egyptian modernization. The political context is worth noting. Egypt in the late 19th century was in flux, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but increasingly under European influence. Khedive Ismail, the ruler of Egypt, had embarked on ambitious modernization projects that left the country deeply in debt. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, had been a triumph of engineering, but a financial disaster for Egypt. By 1879, European powers had forced Ismail to abdicate in favor of his son Tawfiq. The gift of the obelisk was partly diplomatic theater, demonstrating continued friendship with Western powers during this tumultuous period. Similar gifts were made to Britain and France, each receiving an obelisk as a token of Egypt's gratitude and desire for continued good relations. London's went to the Victoria Embankment. Paris placed theirs in the Place de la Concorde. For America, this was more than just a monument. It was recognition, a sign that the young republic was now considered a peer of the ancient European powers. A piece of antiquity far older than Rome was coming to the New World. The symbolism was not lost on Americans of the time, who saw in this gift a validation of their rising status. But now came the problem. How do you move a 200-ton stone from Cairo to Central Park? The man with a plan, the man in charge, was Naval Officer Henry Honeychurch Gorringe. He was no stranger to heavy logistics, but this was something else entirely. Gorringe himself is worth pausing over. Born in Barbados in 1841, he had joined the Union Navy during the Civil War and risen through the ranks to lieutenant commander. Capable, determined, innovative, he was exactly the kind of figure the Gilded Age America celebrated. When offered the task of transporting the obelisk, he saw not just an engineering challenge, but a chance for personal and national glory. The funding for this massive undertaking came not from the government, but from a single wealthy patron, William H. Vanderbilt, heir to the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune. He pledged $100,000 for the project, equivalent to well over $2 million today. Why such generosity? Partly civic pride, partly a desire to leave a lasting legacy in the city whose commerce had made his family rich. Gorings approached the task methodically. He studied accounts of how the Vatican had moved a similar obelisk in the 16th century. He consulted engineers, shipbuilders, and anyone with relevant expertise. He designed custom equipment, and above all, he planned for contingencies, anticipating the thousand things that could go wrong when moving a 3-millennium-old monument across the globe. First, the obelisk had to be lowered. Still standing in Heliopolis, it was embedded in the ground by over 3,000 years of sand and stone. A pit was dug, support scaffolding built. Workmen, many of them locals, stood with ropes, pulleys, levers. It took weeks. The lowering process was delicate, beyond imagining. Think of the consequences of a mistake. A priceless artifact, created by hands dead for thousands of years, shattered because of a miscalculation or a frayed rope. Goring supervised personally, often working alongside his men in the desert heat. The scaffolding creaked, ropes strained. Men shouted in Arabic and English. Slowly, inches at a time, the obelisk tilted away from the vertical position it had held since before the Trojan War. Finally, the obelisk was gently tilted, not broken, not dragged, tilted, lowered onto a specially designed iron carriage with wide axles and heavy wheels. The desert watched in silence. The path to the sea. Next came the transport to Alexandria. The iron carriage rolled across a makeshift rail track laid through narrow village roads. Locals gathered on rooftops to watch the ancient stone roll by like a silent pharaoh on a slow chariot. This segment of the journey presented its own unique challenges. The roads of 19th century Egypt were not designed for such loads. Bridges had to be reinforced or bypassed. Hills required additional teams of men with ropes to prevent dangerous acceleration. At times, the track had to be laid directly through private property, with Gorange negotiating passage rights with landowners along the way. Villages became impromptu festival sites as the obelisk passed through. People who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of ancient monuments, yet rarely thought about them, suddenly saw this piece of their heritage from a new perspective. Some wept, others cheered. Children ran alongside, touching the stone for luck. The journey to the coast took nearly 3 months. Progress was sometimes as little as a few hundred feet per day. Summer heat baked the workers. Dust coated everything. But inch by inch, the stone that had watched the rise and fall of pharaohs approached the Mediterranean. In Alexandria, the obelisk was loaded onto a specially retrofitted ship, the SS Desug. A hole had been cut in the hull to slide the stone inside, then sealed shut. The Desug had been purchased specifically for this mission, a former Egyptian mail steamer, now modified into the world's strangest cargo vessel. The ship's interior had been largely hollowed out to create space for the obelisk. The stone itself was secured in a custom wooden cradle, designed to distribute its enormous weight and protect it from the ship's movement at sea. Loading the obelisk required precise timing with the tides and another complex system of ramps and pulleys. The stone had to enter the ship horizontally through the hull breach, then be secured before the opening could be resealed and waterproofed. Any mistake risked sinking the vessel before the journey even began. The voyage across the Atlantic took over a month, through storms, past Gibraltar, across the open sea. Imagine being a sailor on that journey, the strange cargo creaking in the hold as the ship pitched in Atlantic swells. The knowledge that you carried not just a stone, but a witness to history, a thing made by hands that had turned to dust before Rome was founded. The Desug encountered at least one significant storm during the crossing. The ship rolled dramatically, waves broke over the deck, and in the hold, despite all precautions, the obelisk shifted slightly in its cradle. Crewmen worked frantically to resecure it, knowing that if this massive weight broke free during a storm, it could breach the hull and send ship, crew, and ancient treasure to the bottom of the Atlantic. At last, in July 1880, the obelisk arrived in New York Harbor. Crowds watched as the stone that had once stood for Ra, the sun god, now passed beneath the Statue of Liberty. The final mile, the final journey from the harbor to Central Park, was its own epic. Streets had to be closed, tracks laid, thousands gathered daily to watch the stone creep uptown. It took 112 days. New York in 1880 was a city in transformation. Already America's largest metropolis, it was pushing upward with early skyscrapers and outward with new neighborhoods. Central Park, the planned urban oasis, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, was still relatively new, having opened just 23 years earlier. The path chosen for the obelisk ran from the Hudson River at 96th Street, eastward, and then south to the park. This route avoided the most densely built areas, but still required navigating urban streets never designed for such a load. Special railroad tracks were laid. Buildings were sometimes altered to allow passage. When the stone reached its final approach to the park, it had to cross a small bridge, reinforced just for this purpose. Engineers held their breath as the full weight rolled across. But their calculations proved sound. Progress through the city streets became a daily spectacle. Newspapers provided regular updates. Vendors sold refreshments to the crowds that gathered. Children played obelisk games, mimicking the slow progress of the Great Stone. For weeks, the city's conversation revolved around this visitor from antiquity making its tedious way to its new home. On January 20, 1881, the obelisk was raised again, this time in Central Park, near the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The ceremony was solemn, grand. Egyptian dignitaries, American officials, and curious citizens stood bundled in coats as a piece of ancient sunlight returned to the sky. The raising itself was another marvel of engineering. Using techniques both ancient and modern, a turning platform had been built, allowing the obelisk to be rotated from horizontal to vertical. As it rose degree by degree, the crowd's excitement grew. When it finally settled onto its new base, with a sound like distant thunder, cheers erupted across the park. They called it Cleopatra's Needle, though it had nothing to do with Cleopatra. Names stick, stories shift, a stone in time, and now it stands there still, through New York winters and summers, through world wars and economic cycles, through the rise of cars, airplanes, computers, smartphones. A stone that was ancient when Cleopatra was born watches as children play frisbee and tourists snap photos. What does the obelisk think of New York? If stones could remember, what would it make of this strange new land so different from the desert where it was born? The climate is all wrong. Humid summers, freezing winters, acid rain. Its hieroglyphs, once crisp and precise, have weathered more in 140 years of New York air than they did in thousands of years of Egyptian desert. In 2014, a team of conservators cleaned and restored the obelisk, protecting it from further deterioration. They found the stone in remarkably good condition, considering its journey and exposure. Tough, this desert granite, made to last. Symbolically, the obelisk stands at an interesting crossroads of American identity. It arrived during the Gilded Age, when America was flexing its industrial and financial muscles on the world stage. It represented both the young country's fascination with antiquity and its ambition to claim a place among civilization's great inheritors. Today, it represents something more complex, questions of cultural patrimony, of who owns the past, of how artifacts should be preserved and shared. Some have called for its return to Egypt. Others see it as rightfully belonging to its adoptive city after 140 years. The hieroglyphs themselves were barely understood when the obelisk arrived in New York. Jean-François Champollion had deciphered the Rosetta Stone just 58 years earlier, beginning the modern understanding of hieroglyphic writing. Today, we can read the obelisk's inscriptions with confidence. Praise to Thutmose III, and additions by his grandson, Thutmose IV. Declarations of divine favor and earthly power. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the obelisk is how it connects us, directly, physically, to people who lived and worked and dreamed 3,500 years ago. The hands that carved those hieroglyphs were human hands, attached to human minds, not so different from our own. They created something meant to last beyond their brief lives, to speak to eternity. And it has. The Night Watch. As night deepens over Central Park, the obelisk stands in darkness. Most visitors have gone. The museum has closed its doors. Traffic hums distantly on Fifth Avenue, and the stone waits, as it has waited through thousands of nights before this one. If you should find yourself there, alone in the small hours, pause beside this traveler from antiquity. Look up at its weathered face. The moonlight catches the deep-cut hieroglyphs, creating shadows where once there was bright paint. The granite still holds warmth from the day's sun, a distant cousin of the Egyptian sun that first called it from the earth. Place your hand against it if you dare. Feel the slight roughness of a stone that once was glassy smooth. Is that a vibration you feel? Or just your pulse in your fingertips? Is that a whisper you hear? Or just the wind through nearby trees? What would it tell you, this witness to empires? What wisdoms has it absorbed through its long watching? What secrets of pharaohs and priests, of quarrymen and sailors, of Victorian engineers and modern conservators? The stone keeps its counsel. It has outlasted its makers, its movers, its first admirers. It will likely outlast us too, as the wind through the park hums like desert air and stars wheel overhead just as they did above Heliopolis. The obelisk reminds us of our brief moment in time's long flow. It stands as testament to human ingenuity, ambition, cooperation, and our deep desire to leave something behind that says, "We were here. We made this. Remember us." Sleep now, with the obelisk standing guard over your dreams. It has watched over countless sleepers before you. It will watch over countless more to come. The pharaohs are dust. The gods they carved in stone are silent, but the stone itself endures, crossing oceans of water and time to stand beneath different stars, still reaching for the sun. These stories are not just names in a textbook. They are echoes of lives lived under the same sun we see today. They remind us that every age has its builders, its believers, its revolutionaries, and its dreamers. And they remind us gently how far we've come. So now, dear listener, you've survived a day in ancient Egypt. You've felt the sun, eaten the gritty bread, ducked the divine wrath, and maybe, just maybe, found a bit of quiet under a starlit sky. Sleep now, knowing that in your soft bed, with your filtered water and your electric fan, you're living like a pharaoh by comparison. So, the next time you groan about a slow elevator or warm coffee, just remember, at least you're not exfoliating with sand or using beer as mouthwash. Good night, traveler in time. May your dreams be soft, your sheets be cool, and your soul remain lighter than a feather. Until next time.